ancestors who began the march of humankind in the womb of Mother Africa, we ask these ancestors to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of the African ancestors who began the march of humankind in the womb of Mother Africa and marched down the Nile, laying the foundations for human civilization and culture, we ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of these African ancestors who built their pyramids and their temples to their God concepts, to their principles, and to their moral values, who left us a legacy of architectural and monumental building unparalleled in the history of the world, we ask these ancestors who built the pyramids, who built the temples, to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. We ask these African ancestors who took this African culture and extended it throughout Africa, building the stone cities of Zimbabwe, building the empires of the Sudan, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, building the Swahili city-states along the east coast of Africa, and in Christian Africa, asking King Lalibela and giving him the courage to build the 12 churches of Lalibela from the ground down, monuments to the world. We ask these Africans who spread this culture to the Dogo and to the Akan and to the Yoruba and to the Bankango and to the Zulu. We ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of the Africans who opened up Africa, opened up the Nile Valley to other cultures and other peoples, and they came in and nurtured themselves on the African greatness. First coming in early with the ancient Hebrews, and they synthesized this culture and produced Judaism. Later coming in were the Christians, and they synthesized this culture and produced Christianity. Coming in were also the Greeks, who took the African culture, synthesized it, and produced Greek civilization. And then later, the Prophet Muhammad, and with the Arabs coming into the Nile Valley, they synthesized the culture and produced Islam. We ask these African ancestors, who as part of their legacy laid the foundations for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Greek civilization, to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. We ask those African ancestors pulled out of Africa, taken to the hells of North America, South America, the Caribbean, maintaining the spirit of African humanity in their hearts and in their minds, and who left us this enormous legacy of struggle. We ask those Africans who resisted enslavement in the villages of Africa, who resisted enslavement in the shores of Africa, who resisted enslavement in those forts and dungeons, who resisted enslavement in the holes of those ships, who resisted enslavement when they arrived on these shores in the New World. We ask these Africans who ran into the highlands of northeast Brazil and established for 100 years the first free republic in the Americas, the Republic of Palmares, and their last great leader, Zumbi, who speared and sacrificed. We ask these Africans who replicated the Brazilian experience and went into the highlands of Jamaica and became the maroon-free communities. We ask these Africans who went into the backwoods of the Guyanas and Suriname and created free republic of the Suramaka and the Ajuka. We ask these Africans who went into the backwoods of Georgia and the swamps of Florida and moved with the Seminole Indians and resisted oppression. We ask these Africans who left us a legacy of struggle and resistance, the likes of which no one in the world has, to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. We ask these Africans who created and laid for us a foundation of struggle and resistance that was passed on generation after generation, that was passed on to Harriet Tubman, who fought her way out of enslavement and became a symbol of freedom for all of us. Similarly, Frederick Douglass and hundreds of thousands of others fought their way out of enslavement. We ask those Africans who went with Boukman Dessalines to create the greatest revolutionary experience in the history of the world, the Haitian Revolution, leaving us a legacy, the likes of which no one else has had. We ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future.
Thank you. want to say good morning to you and welcome to the Running African Show. It's now 8 minutes after 6. My name is Digi Chris and I'll be sitting in for Kabo Mathat Kheru. And the program will be going as usual with African music, as you just heard, devotion, meditation and stuff like that. And in the show today we'll be having a rebroadcast. That's two of the features in the show. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. You're listening to the Running African. You're listening to the sounds of Reggae Makossa. We're going to take a break. On the flip side, the show continues. So keep it locked right here. Roots Rocking Reggae Radio. It's now 6:15.
Pay tribute and honor our ancestors, those who were tried and sentenced for their role in the 1831-1832 Emancipation War in Jamaica, the parish of Westmoreland.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me.
Garrick from Belfast in St. James, sentenced to 259 lashes. David Gibson from Clifton, sentenced to death. John Gilling, owned by Mrs. Parcher, sentenced to 36 lashes. Ishmael, alias Billy Grant from Prospect, 100 lashes. James Green, Clifton, sentenced to death. Frederick Gray from Rose Hill, sentenced to 100 lashes. Sam Hilton from Lambs River, sentenced to 100 lashes. Philip Irving from McHale's Prospect, sentenced to 100 lashes.
William McIntosh from Belfontaine St. James, sentenced to 250 lashes. Duncan McKenzie from Flower Hill, sentenced to be transported. William McKinley, owned by S. Whittingham, sentenced to death. Richard McLeod from McHale's Prospect, sentenced to death. James Miller, owned by Dr. Fuller, sentenced to 160 lashes. John Morris from Clifton, acquitted. Coffee, alias Richard Morrison from Rock Pleasant, sentenced to be transported.
Richard Shelton from Duckett Spring and Lambs River, sentenced to 200 lashes. Premier, alias Richard Skelton from Coe Park, sentenced to be transported. John M. L. Stevens from Stevenage, sentenced to 200 lashes. George Tharp, owned by enslaver George Tharp, sentenced to 150 lashes. Titus, alias George Waite from Richmond, sentenced to death. George Watson from Horton Grove, sentenced to be transported.
Robert Whitehorn from Clontarf, sentenced to death. Edward Whittingham from Coe Park, sentenced to 200 lashes. Eliza Whittingham from Coe Park, sentenced to death. Jane Whittingham from Coe Park, sentenced to be hanged. S. Whittingham from Coe Park, sentenced to be transported. Robert Wigan from Lambs River, sentenced to be transported. Archie Wilson, owned by enslaver Archibald Wilson, sentenced to 150 lashes. John Wiley from Barnside, sentenced to be transported.
Robert Morris, owned by Mary Spence, Stewie, sentenced to death. George Murray from Clifton, sentenced to death. Edward Partner, owned by Isabella Partner, sentenced to death. Philip, owned by William Shellett, sentenced to 6 months imprisonment.
Southern trees, barren, strange fruit, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
Henry Cooper
from Cow Park, sentenced to death. Henry Cowan from Argyle Pen, sentenced to death. Robert Davis from Sweet River, sentenced to be transported. Thomas Davis from Enfield, sentenced to be transported. Matty, alias Richard Drackett, owned by Mary Torrent, acquitted. John Ellory, owned by a white sailor, sentenced 14 days imprisonment. Hugh Ferguson from Clifden, sentenced to death. William Ferguson from Clifden, acquitted. Jack, alias John Fleming, owned by Daniel McGibbon, sentenced to 50 lashes.
William Evans, alias Alexander Bentlos, from Welsh Pool Plantation, sentenced to death. William Brooks. Edward Barrett, from Duckett Spring and the Lambs River Plantation, sentenced to death. John Bull, owned by Edward J. Young, sentenced to death. John Campbell, from Floor Hill, sentenced to 120 lashes. William Chambers, owned by Mary Gray, sentenced to death. David Clark, owned by a Mr. Young, sentenced to 120 lashes.
Samuel Jarrett from Crow Park, sentenced to death. Amelia Johnson, acquitted. Nelson Carr from Belfast St. James, sentenced to 250 lashes. Edward Lambden from Barneside, sentenced to death. Robert Lambert, owned by William Gillette, Esquire, sentenced to 39 lashes. John Linton from Heritage, sentenced to death. Joe Little from Welchpool, sentenced to be hanged but mercifully escaped.
James Reed from Hermitage, sentenced to death. Thomas Reed from Lambs River, sentenced to 150 lashes. James Ricketts, owned by Edward J. Young, sentenced to death. Thomas Rook, McHale's Prospect, sentenced to 100 lashes. Samuel Sampson, owned by Mary Torrent, sentenced to 14 days imprisonment.
William Martin from Cow Park, sentenced to be transported. A.C. McHale from McHale's Prospect, sentenced to death. George McHale from McHale's Prospect, sentenced to 100 lashes. John McCallum from McHale's Prospect, sentenced to 60 lashes. Robert McGee from Cow Park, sentenced to 200 lashes. Alexander McGrother, owned by Mary Torrent, sentenced to 200 lashes. James McIntosh, owned by Amelia McIntosh, sentenced to 250 lashes. Richard, alias Richard McIntosh from Belfont in St. James, sentenced to 100 lashes.
Robert Allen, owned by enslaver Isabella Partner, sentenced to 4 dozen lashes. Jack Anderson, from the Retrieve Plantation, sentenced to death. John Appleton, from the Duckett Spring and Lambs River Plantation, sentenced to 100 lashes. David Atkinson, from Darlaston, sentenced to death. William Atkinson, Darlaston, sentenced to death. Fred, alias William Ball, owned by enslaver Mary Millin, sentenced to death. Daniel Barrijam, from Chillons, sentenced to death. Billy, alias William Binham, from Golden Spring, sentenced to death.
Blood on the leaves and blood at the roots. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
We remember and honor those who walked and worked before us and thus paved the path down which we now walk.
Hanging from the poplar trees.
And that was our special feature, Names of Ancestors Tried and Sentenced. It's now 26 minutes after 6, and you're listening to the Running African Show. DJ Chris sitting in studios on behalf of Kabu, Mahad Kheru. And as I was telling you earlier on, that our special feature, one of our special feature this morning is an interview, a rebroadcast of an interview with Andrea Williams, the author of Help Me Find My People, the African American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. And this was aired on September 1, 2013. So we're going to get right into that rebroadcast right now. It's the Running African Show Roots Rocking Reggae Radio.
Going to go to the phone lines now to speak with Professor Andrea Williams. Help me to find my people, the African American search for family lost in slavery. Professor Heather Andrea Williams is a former attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice and the New York State Attorney General's Office. Is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's author of Help Me to Find My People, and also her first book, Self-Taught African American Education in Slavery and Freedom. Professor Williams joins me on the phone lines. Professor Andrea Williams, good morning.
Good morning, Andrea Williams.
Yeah, we had to do that. I just want to say to you that this is a moving book. I was saying to listeners all morning that I've read In Miserable Slavery, Cicero Diaries, and I found that really difficult to read, a whole different kind of book. Now, I experienced all kinds of emotions reading Help Me to Find My People. And at times it was also difficult for me to read because I experienced anger, and at times I cried. And one time I was holding my breath and I didn't realize until I realized I couldn't breathe. So all kinds of things happened to me when I was reading this book, and I had to look at myself. I had to ask questions of myself, a lot of critical reflection there about my own feelings about slavery and the fact that we need to have a conversation, a discussion about this as a people. If I'm feeling this way and I've been talking so much about it, what about those who haven't even begun to tap into all of those latent and hidden emotions? So let me just get that off and tell you that that's what your book did to me.
Okay.
All right. It must have been also for you an emotional journey. I couldn't help but think that because I could feel you in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can't really avoid it. It's a book about emotions, and I'm trying to get access to the feelings that people who were slaves in America had. And I'll tell you, as a historian, as somebody who's doing this work, you can't cry all the time because then you wouldn't get anything done.
Yes.
But there were moments, I can remember in particular, there was the second chapter, I think, had the biggest emotional impact on me, which is the one about separation of husbands and wives. Mm-hmm. And I call them husbands and wives even though they could not be legally married. As slaves, they were considered property, and as property, they couldn't enter into contracts, and that's what marriage is. Mm-hmm. And I remember two specific things while I was writing that chapter. I was determined to finish it by January 1st of whatever year it was. So I was working late on the 31st, and I'm going to finish it by midnight. And at some point that afternoon, I just had such a bad stomach ache, and I knew that it was that stress. How you're saying you were holding your breath and you didn't realize it, and I think I was doing that too. And when you're holding your breath and when your muscles are tight, and it actually caused pain, and I got up and I said, I have to go, and I went and to the store and bought some sweets or something, but I was very conscious of my connection to these people. And then I was doing, when I was doing research for that chapter, or finding things that went into that chapter, I was in the archives here on my campus at University of North Carolina, and I found, and I cite it in the chapter, I found a document in which a slave owner said, here, I'm writing out the marriage vows that I use when I marry my Negroes. And what I noticed about it was that he replaced God in those vows. So God doesn't appear. And you would say, we're gathered here before God and these witnesses. He said, before me and these witnesses. And in other parts of the vows, you could see that he had substituted himself. And so I went and did further research to see if in the 1840s, the vows were the vows that we now know, and they were the very same vows. They've been handed down to us that you hear in traditional marriage ceremonies. And so he had and he had that power. He could give these vows, but it was, and at the end it never said, let no man put us under. What God has joined together, let no man put us under. That's not in the vows. And that's one of the things that a lot of these enslaved people complained about and talked about, was that nobody ever said that in their vows, because it was always understood that the owner had the power. And so I found that document, and in that same research session that week, I was finding lots of letters between white owners, wives, correspondences in which they were saying, oh, you know, Mrs. So-and-so was murdered in her sleep, and they suspect that one of her Negroes did it. And that's how they would refer sometimes to the people they owned, you know. So one of her Negroes, and she was such a lovely woman. Or there's talk of a conspiracy, and that the Negroes are going to rise up. And so I thought about those two things beside each other, how an adult man and woman may have felt about the fact that somebody, some other adult, had the power and the authority to give them permission to get married, or to deny them permission, or to utter wedding vows, or not, to substitute himself for God. So that kind of, the frustration, the humiliation, the anger that they may have felt, and then the fears that these whites had about the black people turning against them. And in that week, my next book was born, which is going to be called Murder on the Plantation, and it's going to be about violence in the antebellum South. But, you know, it's not just black people killing white people. But
I'm really looking forward to that, because I saw that note in your book. I'm really looking forward to you know, how this develops. Let us talk a little bit, because we jumped right in, but let's talk a little bit about how you came to write this book, and also about the sources, how you got all of this information, documentary evidence to compile such a moving book.
Well, I first began to think about the book, and I didn't even know it was going to be a book, but I was doing research while I was working on my dissertation, and my dissertation became the first book on African-American education in slavery and freedom. But I was looking in black newspapers that people started publishing right after the Civil War, so 1863, 64, 65, into the 70s. And so as soon as slavery ended and they were free and they were able to do this, they were publishing these newspapers, which means that some of them had become literate even though it was illegal. And I started to come across these ads that were captioned "Information Wanted." I had seen some of them in books before, but then I was seeing them in the newspapers as they had appeared in the classified section. And somebody might say, I am searching for information is wanted of my mother, who lived in Fauquier County, Virginia, and he had been separated from his mother for 21 years, and he was searching for her now that the Civil War was over. And I was very, very moved by these ads. I mean, just, you know, that lump in your throat kind of, because at first all I could see was the pain of these losses and these separations. And you had people, you know, mother looking for children, husband looking for wife and children, all the configurations that you can imagine, usually within a nuclear family. And so I started looking for them, not just stumbling across them. And by the end of the summer, I had found 400 of them. Over the years, I've come across almost 1,500 of them. And so I first saw the pain, and then I saw the hope, because it took something for you to go down to the newspaper or to mail a note or to go and get your minister to write a letter for you to the newspaper. It cost money in most cases to place the ads, but they were going through that, trying to find family members. So over the years, I finished the other book, and I needed to work on this one and to figure out how. So the ads are at the core of it, the ads, but you can't tell the story of the search for family lost in slavery unless you've talked about the loss in slavery. And so the book is divided up in that way, that I first talk about the separations and the conditions.
And really, and that made that made a big difference the way you've ordered the book and the amount of time you've spent talking about separation, children being separated from parents, looking at and comparing children separated from mothers as opposed to children separated from father, and even exploring the emotions of how mothers responded to children who separated as opposed to how husbands and wives responded, and delving into that to some extent. I want to talk about that in terms of how you've ordered the book, because I think even for our listeners' sake, that we probably need to take it along the same trajectory that you did, which is to first of all look closely at the separation and to talk about separation, children from parents in doing slavery. I was really moved by that, and the first page, the first chapter kind of drew us into slavery and the relationship between the children among themselves and between children and parents. Can we talk about that? Because you talk about an awareness at some point among children that they were enslaved and that their parents could not protect them.
Right. And I found, you asked about sources also. In that chapter, I start with a letter that I found in an archive at the University of Virginia. And it was a typed, very short letter, but one white man writing to another white man saying, a friend of mine has this fine black boy for sale. He's about 12 years old, and he describes him physically, and you'd better hurry and come if you want to purchase him. And I found that letter, and I said, what am I going to do with this? I don't even know this boy's name. I don't know if he was sold. I don't know. And so I decided to build a chapter around him to talk about children who did experience separation. And one of the things that you mentioned that I found as I went through the sources was that many people who had been separated as children, when they wrote their life stories or they told an interviewer about their lives, they said, as young children, we did not know that we were slaves. We didn't understand this concept of slavery or enslavement. We were children. We played in the yard. Sometimes we played with the white person, the owner's children. And we had jobs, you might fan the flies. Booker T. Washington said his job was to fan the flies from the white people's table, that kind of thing. But we didn't understand. And then they would see a strange white man come onto the plantation, and one of their friends would leave, would disappear. And they started to realize that some of them said they would hide whenever a white man came on the plantation, somebody they didn't know, because they associated that with being taken away. It got even worse if an owner was very, very sick. They would start to hear the adults in their slave community talking about, the owner's sick. If he dies, what's going to happen to us? How are they going to separate us? Am I going to be able to go with my children? Because they knew that the imminent death of an owner meant sale or division, because the owner in his will may have said, I want 10 of these people to go with my daughter and her husband, and then 10 to go, and so on. And so they would be sold or handed down. And so the parents were getting frantic about it. And so the children came to understand that, number one, they were slaves, and number two, being a slave meant you could be sold, and number three, your parents really were powerless to help you. To intervene in that. And some parents did try, some adults tried to beg that the owner sell them with their children, or to ask that a husband not be sold away or a wife not be sold away. But it was really all at the mercy of the owner. They had the people themselves did not have the power to stop this. And so this was an awakening, an awareness that several people talked about, that as you're 7 or 8 or 9 years old and you're becoming aware that your family connection is fragile and that somebody else has ultimate control over it.
And I'm going to keep coming back to this because, you see the movies and, we've had conversations about these ideas through the history books and so on. Yes, this happened in slavery. But what you've done is to find in your research case studies, actual persons talking, whether through ads that they placed in the newspaper or slave narratives, through all the different sources that you had, actual persons talking about their own personal experiences, whether as children, as husbands, or as wives. And this is what made the whole thing for me so painful to read, because now I came face to face with our ancestors. I came face to face with the reality of the human being then, the African. So let's talk a little. So here we have, separation is a theme that I said, is a big part of the book. So we have children being separated from parents. That awareness that children had at some point that they could not be protected. But one of the things you looked at also, as I said earlier, was how mothers responded and how fathers responded. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for us, what you found and the conclusions that you could possibly draw on that?
Well, as I did the research, as you're working with the material, you start to see some patterns, and not everybody fits into a pattern. And clearly, as a scholar, you're getting just pieces of the actual experiences. But I saw women who really threw themselves on the ground trying to plead with an owner or a slave trader, because people were sold sometimes on the very plantation. So somebody might come onto the plantation, that white man those kids were afraid of. Or they might be taken to a marketplace, a slave market, and auction. They might be auctioned in this public space where they were inspected and examined and that kind of thing. And in all of those spaces, you see some women who really tried so hard to hold on to their children, and they might be pleading, please let me keep even one of my children. Please just let me keep even one. With fathers, one of the stories about a father that sticks with me is a young boy talks about his mother was sold away with several of the children. So they're taken away. He's left there with his father and his grandfather. And the father, he said, had been this happy. First he describes how his mother was just crying and weeping and hoping that she would be able to stay with some of her children. And then the father, he said, just became sullen. And the author didn't, in his narrative, he didn't say, my father became depressed. He never used that word. But everything that he described, everything he said about him, suggested that the father just sank into himself and withdrew and became depressed and eventually escaped because he heard that he was about to be sold. And so the boy was then raised by his grandfather. So one of the differences that I see, one of the things that started to emerge for me was that a lot of people said, I basically held my tongue. I was silenced. I was struck silent. I couldn't speak. So as you're seeing your wife taken away, I couldn't speak. And you see men and women saying that when it's husbands and wives being separated. I was struck dumb. I just could not. There was no response. There was no way I could respond to this terrible thing that was happening to me. I didn't say a word. But with what I saw was that with parents losing children, the mothers were very expressive, tended to be very expressive, and weeping and throwing themselves on the ground and begging and holding on to their children. But sometimes when it was the separation of husband and wife, they just were mute. And what I think about it, because they don't tell me why, but what I sort of interpret is that with the children, first of all, there may have been a closer emotional attachment to the children, but also that there was no expectation, no reasonable expectation that an owner would relent when it was a husband and wife being separated, because the owner had already made it clear that their marriage was at his will. That he could decide if they were going to stay together, that sale was always a possibility. And so maybe you don't weep and beg when that's imminent, because you know that it's not going to make any difference. But still, you know, I think.
But even in the stories, the pain is so palpable. One husband in particular that you wrote about, his own story that you retold. You know, seeing just in the field and seeing the coffle of slaves, enslaved Africans passing by, and realize his wife was there. And asked, can I give her some money, and was and talked about how he held on to her hand for I hope I'm not mixing up two stories, but all those stories,
no, you're right.
Yeah, for a long time, and couldn't speak, and so even in that silence, the pain even for me was unbearable. I think.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're muted by the pain and by the sense of being unable to make any difference, and so I think the silences were powerful, and they tell you about the silence because they remember it. They remember that they were just struck. And imagine you wake up in the morning and you go out to the field. I start one of the chapters with a quote like that. The man said you would leave your house and go out, and then when you come back, your children and your wife are gone. And so this particular person was in the fields, and it seems, there's this picture I have in my mind of the way that people describe it, that they would be working in whatever field, and then there's this coffle, as you mentioned, where people might be chained together, and they're being taken. And so then the people working in the field would come out and stand on the side of the road and watch the people passing by, people they knew, maybe people they didn't know, and sometimes they would sing a song, and they had these songs about, we'll see each other again, and that kind of thing. So it happened frequently enough that there were rituals around it, that you stopped, and of course stopping work could mean that you would be whipped or punished in some way because you're supposed to be working, but they would stop and basically pay their respects. And then he comes out and he sees, this is somebody I love who's being taken away, and nobody said anything to me. The overseer is saying, don't get close to her. And so, it's really powerful, and to have them tell us the stories, I think, is really important. That it's not me telling you, it's them.
The voices, very, very loud and very real, so that we actually identify with them. You talk about this the separation, and you talk about separation, ambiguous loss, and the separation during slavery as being compared to death. I want to look at that in a moment, because in the introduction of the book, one of the things you argued, and help me out here, because I think you're arguing about how people, some of the discourse that we have today regarding the African family and the extent to which there seems to be a disintegration, the absence of the father, the single-parent home, and so on, and that some have identified or try to connect this reality of the African family today to the experience of slavery. But you've said that so much has happened in between slavery, emancipation, and now that you're not making that leap. That the absence of the father and so on. And then you go on to show the extent to which the family was important in slavery, the importance of family during slavery. Can we talk about that?
Yes. Those are, big things. But basically, over the last really 50 years, people have talked about this matriarchal family. And I talk about Patrick Moynihan, who wrote a report. And really linking what they see as the breakdown of the current black family. So if it's 1963, 1965, or today, directly to slavery. And one of the things that I say is there was a lot of loss and there was a lot of separation, and slavery destroyed many black families, but I don't think you can ever say that slavery destroyed the black family, because if you look through my book, but also Herbert Gutman's book, you see that people care deeply, and of course some people stopped caring, and some people in the face of pain, some people will withdraw and they will just shut down. But I think what the evidence shows is that people continue to form new families. There was a certain kind of resilience. And what you find is that after slavery, people are searching for their family who they lost during slavery, but some of them were in other families. They had remarried, had other children, because otherwise, I mean, there wouldn't be many African Americans after slavery, right? People kept going on and loving and caring, and so you cannot say that there's some kind of emotional abandonment of family and family members that occurred. In fact, just the opposite. Up until 1903, I'm seeing people still searching for people they had lost before 1863. So there's that. And then I think what my big claim is that slavery and racism grew up alongside each other in American society and in other societies as well, but you can see it very, very clearly here that they enslaved black people. They tried Indians, but eventually, you know, it's going to be Africans. And English people had already decided that slavery was morally wrong and that they were not going to enslave other English people or other white people or other Christians, as they called it. And then they create this system of racism that says these people are different from us. They say, for instance, we will not enslave other Christians. So the Africans say, okay, I'm going to be a Christian. And then they say, they write a law that says, you can be a Christian if you want, but that's not going to get you out of slavery. And so black people are getting marked as slaves, and they're only fit to be slaves. And I think the really important thing is that even after slavery ended, racism survived, and racism and white supremacy survived, and kept reproducing themselves on black families and on black people. It's happening during slavery, and it changes over time after slavery. And so we cannot just say, well, slavery caused this thing to happen. We have to also think about all the intervening things. Segregation, I don't know, the crack epidemic, whatever it is, whatever these social forces are, unequal education, unequal access to jobs. So there's a lot that has an impact on any particular black person, any particular black family, on black people across the board in America. And so it's kind of a delicate argument, because the racism did emerge along with slavery and as a justification for slavery, but slavery itself is not the only thing. I think one of the things that have happened.
I think, Prof, one of the things that I took away from the book, and I knew at the moment that I was actually getting it, was that sometimes we do not spend enough time thinking about family and family life during slavery, how husbands, what they were thinking, was what were going through their mind in terms of their family, trying to protect their wives or their children, and also, you know, just a nuclear family. We really haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, the extent to which the African, the enslaved person valued family. You talk, for example, about marriage, and let me just take a quick break and come back to that. I see that we do not have enough time, but if we have to do 2 interviews, for example, about marriage, and let me just take a quick break and come back to that. I see that we do not have enough time, but if we have to do 2 interviews, we'll do 2. But let me take a quick break and come back.
Okay.
We're speaking with Professor Heather Andrea Williams. She's author of Help Me to Find My People, the African-American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. Professor Williams, one of the things that really jumped out at me as I was saying earlier from reading the book, and the chapter on the separation between husbands and wives and then the search really helped me to see that family, the enslaved person valued family above all else. We heard it coming out in the letters that you unearthed, the slave narratives, the interviews, etc. So let's talk about that. The husband who wanted to marry just to be able to endure slavery. The husband who literally didn't want to marry because it would affect whether or not he would be able to escape to freedom and so on. What value did enslaved persons place on family and marriage in particular?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I can never say that this is the case for everybody, that anything is the case for everybody, because just like us, they were complex human beings. And I think that's what part of doing this work does, is to show us that there are different kinds of people. So I always say, of course, there were some men or women who didn't care about family or didn't, withdrew through the pain or whatever. So just to acknowledge that just like us, some people didn't value family. But I do find a lot of evidence that family was important and that these connections that people made through family were important to them. And as you say, in that chapter, I start out with these three men, and they come at marriage from different positions. So one tells you about his life and how he had been separated from his family, from his original nuclear family, and that pain and that loss. And then almost in the next breath, so in the next paragraph or the next sentence, he talks about getting to a certain age and wanting to find a wife, somebody he could love and who would love him. And you can see that kind of connection, that he's looking for somebody because he's lost so much. And then he ends up being separated from her. And then you have somebody else who says, look, I am a young man, I am enslaved, I do not intend to spend the rest of my life in slavery. If I get married, I know that's going to tie me. And that's exactly what owners wanted. Owners encouraged people to form these quasi-marital relationships because they knew that if you were in a relationship and if you had children, you were much less likely to escape or to cause problems, because then they could punish not just you but your family as well. And so Henry Bibb says, I'm not getting married until I'm free. But then he meets this woman and he describes her as just being beautiful and talented, and she had a lovely voice, and he falls in love with her. But then they agree that they will escape slavery together, and that's a whole long, terrible, sad story. Because he ends up out of slavery. She ends up being the concubine of her owner. And so people, I think, came at it for different reasons. And to hear, one of the things I found in this work that I had never known, had never anticipated, was to find these men who talk about being in love and about really caring about this woman. So you have Henry Bibb, who falls deeply in love, and he escapes and he keeps going back into slave country, basically, to try to find his wife and his child and to get them out. And he ends up in Canada without them. But he risked being re-enslaved or being captured because he wasn't free. To rescue his family. Then I found these love letters that these men wrote, two men wrote to their wives, it was years after being separated. And I had just never expected to find anything like that. But you see this expression of love, this expression of caring and longing. One person said he had remarried because I think what happened was that he and his former wife belonged to the same person, and then he was taken away. And so then he married somebody else, and he said, she was beautiful, but I thought I would love her as much as I loved you, but it didn't work out. And we've quit for 2 years. So how are you, Melinda? And who are you married to now? Because the assumption was that you would remarry. Because, as you said, this connects into that idea of separation as death. That when you're taken away, you don't know if you'll ever see that person again. And so, so you see these profound expressions of love and longing.
Well, I can tell you, sorry to interrupt, Pop, but I just wanted to share this with our listeners, because I don't even know if you've got your book with you, but this is one of the places when I really bawled, page 55, where I think it was Thomas Jones who was talking about his heart yearning. My heart yearned to have a home, if it was only the wretched home of the unprotected slave, to have a wife to love me and to love. And then talking about the longing for the wife and the reasons he gave. He wanted a friend with whom he could tell his story of sorrows, of unsatisfied longing, of new and fondly cherished plans, a companion with whom I could love with all my warm affections, who should love me in return with a true and fervent heart, of whom I might think when toiling for a selfish, unfeeling master, who shall dwell fondly on my memory when we were separated during the severe labors of a day, with whom I might enjoy the blessed happiness of social endearments after the work of each day was over. I bawled. Really, I cried at that. Yeah, I really cried.
Yeah, and then he says, at the end of that, he says, I sought to become a husband and a father because I felt that I could live no longer unloved and unloving.
Reggae Radio, Irie.
It's now a minute after 7, and that's the correct time. Why I said that is because earlier on in the feature you heard minutes after 8. And if you're just joining, you're probably wondering, it's after 8:30. No, it's after 7. You're listening to a rebroadcast with an interview from Professor Andrea Williams, and she's the author of the book, Help Find My People, the African-American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. And as I said, it's a rebroadcast, and it was aired on September 1, 2013. So it's back to our feature.
Yeah, and he had experienced separation from his mother and siblings. And so I had just never, because you don't find many men today expressing these emotions. I certainly hadn't expected to find it in the 19th century.
So we found, you found vulnerable men, vulnerable to love, vulnerable to family, to their children. The man who talks about his child, he's in the field and he heard someone say, that's my papi, or that's my father, and he looks and it is his young child being sold away. All right, in the interest of time, I want to say to you, let's talk about separation next week, but let's just go there for a quick moment. As we still look back at not separation, I mean the search. Even as we look back at the separation, let's talk about that quickly, because here we have now, even during slavery, there was a search going on, and then after emancipation. So let's start with during slavery, the kind of search that went on there, and then after emancipation.
Yeah, during slavery, I mean, people tried all kinds of things, and one of the most vivid, beautiful stories to me is the boy whose mother sent him these beads. Yes. So he and his mother, interesting, he and his sister were the children of the owner's relatives. And that caused great embarrassment to the family, and so they sold them. So here's another, you're not just selling people because you want to make money, but because your cousin had sex with an enslaved woman and produced these children, that's a shame to the family, so then you sell them away. So they sold the three of them, and then they were sold apart. So he lost his mother and his sister. And then one day, a man, an enslaved man, came to the town where he was living and said, I'm looking for such and such, and it turns out it was him. And the mother lived on the same plantation with this man, and she knew that he was going into town because he was carrying, I think, a load of cotton or something into town. And that's where she had last seen her son. And so she sent these blue beads wrapped up, he said, wrapped up was in some white cloth and tied with a string. And when he opened it, he recognized the beads because they belonged to his grandmother. And so then that's how he knew that his mother was looking for him, and now he knew where she was. And he went after, it took him a while to get there. He said he took a pen and paper with him because he had become somewhat literate, and he wanted to go to his mother and convince her to escape. And so he was taking this paper so they could write a pass that said they were free so that they could move about. But his mother said, I can't do it, because since the man came back and told me where you were, I've tried to escape several times, and I've been beaten, and my back is sore, and we'll have to meet in heaven. And then he gets caught, but she sent this memento, this thing that belonged to her mother, that meant a lot to her, that would identify her. So that was just an isolated case, but an example of the creativity of people trying to find family members. People who were literate wrote letters, if you weren't literate, you got somebody else to write a letter back to the owner, usually, because you're dependent on these white people to help you in your search. So you may have been sold away from, on the cover of the book, I've traced over the handwriting of a woman named Violet Lester, who wrote a letter to her this is a girl she grew up with. So this woman had been a child with her and was the daughter of the people who owned her. And she wrote this letter back, and she says, I was sold away, and then she talks about several subsequent sales, and she said, but I want to know what has ever become of my precious little girl, because the owner said he was going to take her somewhere and give her to his sister, and she wants to know what happened to her, because her current owner says that he would purchase the child. So that's a letter, and when you see these letters, they have to be quite obsequious. They have to really tell the owners how much they love them and how much they care about them. And I always say, maybe they did. But it's also, this is the gate through which you have to go. Yes. If you want the information, you have to kind of bow down to the people and say, I care about you, and now I want to know about my child, or I want to know about my wife. Somebody got word that his former owner was going to be traveling somewhere, coming past the place where he lived, and he said, if you're bringing my brother, I don't know if my brother's still alive, and I'm sure he doesn't know that I'm still alive, but I heard that this move is happening, and could you please, when you're passing by, just send a message, stop at this shop and send a message. So people used whatever. In the 1850s in Ohio, the black people started publishing a newspaper, and I've only found one issue of that newspaper, so I don't know if they published any more and they weren't preserved, but in that newspaper you see 2 information wanted ads. So these started in that paper during slavery, looking for family members who had been sold in the South. But then the paper was gone. So they're trying, using whatever mechanisms they could, to reach out and try to find family members. One of the big things they did was to escape. So that most people weren't writing, but you would escape. And if you look in the runaway ads, very, very often, starting in the 1700s, the owner would say he may be going to find his wife on such and such a plantation, or he has a wife living over in that district and he's probably headed there. And
that gave such an insight into the connection between husbands and wives, even though we know the marriage vows that talked about let no man put asunder and so on were not included, and that the owners it appeared would have taken God out of the vows and placed himself there instead of God. That the connection that they all, when there was a runaway, as you show in the book, that they all talked about how this person might be lurking in this particular area because a wife was there or a husband was there. That I think is remarkable.
Yeah, very, very often that was the case. And you know, the owner knows that you purchased her from this place and her husband's there and she's probably headed back there, or the owner may be getting information from other people telling where the person's headed. But you see it quite frequently in the 1700s and the 1800s that the owners say in these ads that the person is going to family member, and very often it's a husband or a wife, but sometimes it's a sister or mother, or just the place where you had come from, you'd been purchased from.
We're speaking with Professor Heather Andrea Williams. She's the author of Help Me to Find My People, the African American Search. for family lost in slavery. Believe me, it is a book that you must get, that you must read. Prepare yourself nicely for it and read and learn about what Africans went through and learn about family. Some of the what I learned while I was reading this book, and I've read it, and reread, was for me, I don't think that even over the years of doing this program that we've spent enough time talking about, even while we talk about slavery, talking about the familial relationships between and among enslaved Africans on the plantation. And in this book, we get an insight into so much of that. We also get a really serious insight into what happened in terms of how people who were separated from each other were sold. And Professor, we talk about separation, but separation was as a result of a few things, as you point out in your book, and one, of course, was sale.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes. So that was the main cause of separation, because the wealth of white Americans in the South lay in land and in people. And people really, that's the investment you could sell. You could easily, it's harder to sell 100 acres of land if you're broke. Instead, you sell 10 people. And so they would cash out because they were in debt, because they wanted to build a new house, all kinds of reasons. After somebody died, again, the estate would be sold, and you see these ads where they're selling the land, they're selling tools, they're selling horses, and they're selling people. And that's all throughout newspapers in the 19th century.
And one thing, and another thing that came out in the book that we haven't talked much about when we discuss slavery is that the sale also came as a result of the repayment of debt. So people were enslaved, Africans were imprisoned while, people decided what should happen in terms of whether or not an enslaver would be able to repay his or her debt, and then Africans would be sold accordingly to repay that debt.
Exactly, because you could mortgage a person. You could put a mortgage on a person. If you wanted a loan to set up your plantation, maybe, you could take out a mortgage, and so then that person could be seized to repay the debt. And that happened quite frequently. And people were in debt for all kinds of things. And I talk at length about this guy, Thomas Chaplin, who just said he entertained a lot. And he incurred debt, and the sheriff was coming to claim some of the people to sell. And so instead of doing that, instead of having the sheriff come and foreclose, basically, he selected 10 people and sent them to the market in Charleston. And the remarkable thing about that is that he kept a journal. And so we have the names, at least the first names of these people. He knew them. He knew their family members. He owned 70 people. And he selected 10 of them to send to the market. And so, the book really gives you this up close. I think I was able to get a close-up look at these processes.
Yes, as a matter of fact, on page 27 of the book, for our listeners, one of the things you said that really hit me was that slavery was a business, and the slave trade the most cold and stark aspect of it. So that at the end of the day, after emancipation, when persons were looking now for their families, help me to find my people, you came back to this to say, it was easier to find persons through a bill of sale, possibly easier.
Well, there's a case where somebody wrote from Virginia looking for his son, and the son had been taken to New Orleans, and he knew the name of the trader, and so he writes to the Freedmen's Bureau set up by the federal government to say, help. We know that this trader took our son, and we think our son is in New Orleans. And so when the Freedmen's Bureau agent went to the trader said, I don't know. I sold a lot of people. I don't know, but maybe in the bill of sale, in the records, you might find a name. But very, very, very hard to get access to bill of sale. I can get access to some of them now because they're in archives, but they were in private hands. The slave traders had them. The companies had them. The person who made the purchase, because this is your titles, really. This says that you own this person. So if the person ran away, you could take this bill of sale to the jailer and say, I own this person. Here's my document. So very, very, very hard to find family after slavery ended. And most people, I think, who tried to find family took to the roads. They just started walking, or they got on a train if they had some money, because they would go back to the places where they had left their families, where they had last seen them. And of course, sometimes you got there and the people had been sold away or died, but they would travel. And so this became a problem in the South for people who were whites who were trying to keep black people in their places. Slavery's over, but we still need the labor. We still need that cotton to be harvested or that corn to be planted. And so then they came up with vagrancy laws because so many Africans were on the road trying to get to family members, and some just trying to exercise this new freedom to move about. So that was one way. Another way was through this Freedmen's Bureau, which part of its mission was to make sure that people stayed on the plantations and performed the labor, because remember, these crops are being taxed by the government. The government wants to maintain a tax base, but the black people kept using them, trying to use them to help them in the search. So they would appeal to them for transportation funds so that they could get on a train to go from Mississippi to Virginia. Because now you're seeing a reverse migration, because one of the things I talk about in the book is that the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, D.C., had sold people down to Mississippi, Texas, South Carolina, and now people are moving back to the northern southern states, trying to get back to their family members. They wrote letters, and then they did these ads, and as I said, I found over 1,000 of them where people were pleading in the newspapers, hoping, and they would ask ministers of the churches, because when you look within black communities right after slavery, the church was the one institution, really, and within those churches then you would have schools. And so they would ask a minister, please read this ad to your congregation, because that way one newspaper might circulate enough among, say, 100, 200 people, because if you read it at service, and then those 100 people go out into the community and say, oh, I heard today that somebody's looking for this person, and trying to circulate information in that way. A lot of people, even before the war ended, before the Emancipation Proclamation even, they saw the Civil War as an escape valve. Just like, when you look at Jamaica in 1831, for instance, where people are saying, the king has declared that we're free, we're free, and then you see these documents that say, no, you're mistaken, you're not free. And so same thing here during the Civil War, where they start to leave these plantations in droves. Thousands of people fled the plantations as the military started to move into the South. And so in those camps, they call them contraband camps, people were searching for family members. That's where they started reconnecting and passing the word. I'm looking for my son. I'm looking for my daughter. I'm looking for my mother. So, but very, very difficult to find, because nobody had been keeping records. Bills of sale were individual documents produced by a particular seller particular seller or trader, but there was no file cabinet that the government kept. There was no record keeping about these people, so they had to just try to find who they could find.
And you say a lot of this reunification for many, and part 3 of the book is entitled Reunification, and you talk about how the search went on through the newspapers, and there's a story you told of something, one of the ads being read out in the church, and somebody in the church actually saying, that's my auntie or something, that's my aunt or something, but that was rare. And
very rare.
And even rarer, it appeared to me from reading the book, is reunification. Even though some did find their families, and even within that, there were problems. Talk about those problems and some of those successful reunification, please.
Yeah, so the book has 3 chapters on separation, 2 on search, and 1 on reunification. And, proportionally, I think that may be right. I think not many people found, or not many people have documented that they found. But when people found each other, I mean, they talk about this joy, and again, some of them were silenced. So they were silenced by the pain of separation, and then they were silenced by the joy of reunification. To find your brother, to look in the face of this person and, see yourself reflected. And you hadn't seen him in 10, 15, 20 years, that kind of thing. And so there's this tremendous joy. But there are also complications because, as I said, many people, after they've been sold, say, from a husband or a wife, had remarried. They formed new families, and so many of them were still looking for their old family, but they had also moved on. And so you see some of those complicated situations where a husband comes back and the wife has remarried, and the wife now has to make a choice, and it happens differently in each situation. One woman said, when I married my second husband, he knew I only married him because I never thought I would see my real husband again. And so she chose to go with the real husband, to go back to the first husband. Somebody else said, the second husband doesn't have anybody and I can't leave him. So you have those kinds of choices that people had to make. Wrenching choices, I think, in some cases. And then you have children. So some fathers, for instance, talk about the fact that they would come back and the children are hiding under the bed because they don't know who this man is. A child says his mother came back. He had been one of those children who, when he was sold, a woman stepped in and nurtured him. And she said, don't cry, I'll take care of you. And so he had grown up thinking she was his mother after that initial separation from his mother. And then one day the woman who had raised him said, your mother's coming for you. And he said, you're my mother. She said, no. And in the mother questions there, I don't know, but I can imagine that there would still be some problems. So he starts to recognize her as his mother, but he had been raised by somebody else with a set of rules, with a set of practices, and now there's somebody else who he has to deal with because he was still a child, and so it's a complex, complicated thing. I found one situation in which one of those love letters, I talked about finding 2 love letters from men, and this man had written to his wife, and she had been taken away by her owner. They belonged to 2 different owners, and it's a long story, but in the end, I found them in the census living in the same household with so the husband, the wife, and children after the Civil War. But that's the only situation in which I was able to find those people back in a household through the census.
And this is an ongoing reality for African people. At some point in the narratives, you mentioned this in your book as being very important. The title of the book is Help Me to Find My People. And you mentioned that at some point the language changed in terms of those who were searching. Now, later on, persons were saying, help me to find my people. And for you, there's a great significance here. Talk to us about that significance of a change in now my people as opposed to my family.
Yes, it's one of those things that I had to try to make sense of because in the beginning, people would say, I'm looking for my mother, my sister, my cousin, a list of people. And then late in the, I think 1880s, 1890s really, I started to see people saying, help me to find my people. And so then and then they list who they're looking for. And what I've made of it is that they're looking for individual family members, but they're also making a broader claim about having had people, of having belonged to a group. So it's a broader statement than just the individual members of my family, but it's my people. I belong to some people. I used to have a community, and I may still be a part of a community, but I'm looking for my people, and that really I noticed that change, and I went back and I looked through the earlier ads, and I thought, something's happening here culturally. There's some kind of claim that they're staking out, and they kept placing these ads. As I said, until 1903 is the last one that I found. And the thing with this book, I will never say that's the last ad that was placed. That's just the last one that I've found, because I think there are others out there that I don't know about. So it's remarkable to me. So for a long time, people were still looking for the physical person. They're still looking for the mother, the father, the sister, hoping to find that person and to be in the presence of that person again. And then after 1903, the ads, I don't see any more ads. But what happened was in the 1930s, as part of trying to get the country back on its feet during the Great Depression, the federal government sent people out throughout the South and to places like Chicago to interview former slaves. So these people had been children very often when slavery ended, because slavery ended 1865. And so now we're talking about the 1930s. And so these are now old people, and they very, very often introduced family separation into their interviews. And you can almost tell that the interviewer is not asking about that, but they're putting in, and I call it this genealogy of separation, that they're introducing. If you're going to write about me, if you're going to tell my story, you need to tell about these other people in my family. And they'll say, my grandmother didn't go with us when we were sold to Mississippi. She stayed in Virginia, so I didn't really know her. Or my father was sold away and we didn't grow up with him. And so they talk about separation and loss. And so I think of that as a way of remembering these people and making sure that their memories and their names are preserved in the historical record, so that somebody like me could come and find it. And then later on, starting in the 70s maybe, after Roots aired, you find a lot of people searching for records of their family. So at first you're searching for the person, the physical person, and then you're talking about the memory of the person, and then it's trying to find any record of that person's existence. So you're going to census data, you're going to bills of sale, you're going to owners' journals, all kinds of documents to do that genealogical research, to try to trace the family history and to get the names of the people. And one of the things, I know you've been talking about genealogy, one of the things that I'm very interested in is that when people are doing genealogical work, the names are important and knowing where the person was and where the person, but to try to have some sense of the environment in which that person may have lived, and to understand the circumstances that make it so hard to now find them. Because if people were sold and there was no record of their sale, that's why so many people hit a wall. You can't find the person because the person was not an official person in that society. There's no, when the census takers came, they would take the name of the white person and the man's wife and children, and then there would be a separate slave census that gave the number of people this person owned, but the names of those people would not be documented. So it's when there's documentation, it's usually just the first name, so very, very hard to retrieve those names. But I really want people to also think about what life would have been like for that person. You may not know directly, exactly, but I think, a lot of us are doing research on slavery here and in Jamaica and in other parts of the diaspora. So to try to get a sense of what their lives were like, so it's not just a name.
And a lot is being done now with DNA testing and so on. And I see because for us, I suppose in this time, in terms of finding the records and understanding the social conditions and political conditions and so on, is also to connect with the roots, to connect with the motherland, so to speak. And I suppose this is what is driving so many persons, whether you can afford it or not, to have these DNA tests, to place you in Rwanda or Nigeria or the region of Ethiopia and so on. How important is that in even the genealogical search for our people?
Well, I think it's important to individual people. You know, some people really want to make those kinds of connections, to go back to know the direct ancestors, and then to know, as you said, where are you from? You know, a lot of people claim Ghana, right? But there are lots of places in Africa from which people came. And so for some people, that's very, very important. There's a woman named Dorothy Redford, and I talk about her in the at the end of the book in the epilogue, because she has done a remarkable thing to trace the lines of Africans on a plantation in eastern North Carolina. And she was doing genealogical research for her family, but she also just traced, I think it's 16 different lines of different families who were on that plantation. And so that was remarkable in and of itself. And then she found that some of the people had been sent to Mississippi and the people, or Alabama, and the people in North Carolina had no idea that they had relatives in Alabama, and the Alabamians didn't know that they had come from North Carolina, because that history had been lost to them. So she reconstituted that separation and the existence of these connections. But then now she's going a step further, and she's trying to find where in Africa the people came from, or where they came from, because that's the thing with the U.S. is that many people, when you look at colonial history, a lot of people were coming from Jamaica, Barbados, you know, and so she's tracing them maybe through the Caribbean and then to Africa. And I know she's made a lot of progress on that. She found one of the ships that came, and she has a manifest and that kind of thing. But so she's a real example of what can be done, but you have to, I mean, she's very good at it, and she's very dedicated to it.
Well, we're going to find her. I think we need to find her to continue the conversation.
Yeah, she's a fantastic person.
You also mentioned in the book, and we have just 2 minutes left really, but you also mentioned in the book Toni Morrison, and that she said through Beloved, says she looked around and found that there were no monuments, there was no bench to go sit and say, you know, this is where my people were. And so she said you said in the book that she talked about Beloved, that book Beloved, as being you know, her way of saying that we needed this, and her own monument, I think, in a way, to those who were enslaved.
So she was writing that in the late 70s, I think, and she said there are no monuments. There's not even a bench to mark a spot where something happened or where some Africans were. And I think the landscape has changed in America. I teach a course where I take students to Charleston, South Carolina, and we go to plantations. And one of the things that I think the plantations are doing it just because it's a good tourism plan, but they're including information about the people who were enslaved there. They're showing you the cabins, that kind of thing. So, and there are more markers. There are more markers on the southern landscape than there were when she wrote Beloved. But I think the important thing about Morrison is it shows us that there's so many ways in which we can put down markers. And so in college classrooms all over the world, people read Beloved. And it's a book that broke through and that is part of the canon now in many literature departments. And so you don't have to go and see a physical marker. You may have to face slavery through the fiction that she created around a real story, because
we're gonna leave that for our listeners to pick up on that, because you also use 2 works of fiction towards the end of the book to even give us a better idea of that search and the reunification and how some of that might have gone down. But because we're out of time, I didn't say in this interview at all that you are Jamaican, that you were born in Jamaica.
Right. I was born in Trelawney. Yeah.
So you're from Trelawney, but you've lived in the U.S. Since 9 years old, is it?
11. I was 11 when I came. We moved to Brooklyn. That typical migration, right?
Yes. All right, Professor Andrea Williams, thank you very much for the work, for the research, for presenting this book. Where's the book available? Can Jamaicans buy this, get this? How do we get this?
Well, I mean, I don't usually advertise, but Amazon has it, which is probably the easiest way to get it. But all those online stores have it. I don't know that it's in any of the bookshops.
Boy, I don't know. I wish Songsters, could you get some of these books? Because on Twitter and Facebook and the email, this is a question that's recurring. How can we get a copy of this book? If we could get some of this in Songsters bookstore here in Jamaica, or the bookshop or somewhere.
Can I just say that the book came out last year, and I've done many interviews. I have not been interviewed by anybody who has read the book so carefully. And I just want to thank you for that. I mean, I really appreciate it. And I know your listeners.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You kind of floored me with that. But thank you very much, Puff. And we'll be in touch. We're looking for the next book, Murder on the Plantation. We can't wait.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Andrea Williams.
And that was a rebroadcast interview with Professor Heather Andrea Williams, the author of Help Me Find My People, the African-American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. And the interview was done by Kheru Kheru, and it was aired on September 1, 2013. We're going to take a break. On the flip side, our next feature, and it's another rebroadcast.
Iria FM.
Hey, got us welcome back, and if you're just joining, got us a special welcome to the Running African Show. DJK sitting in on behalf of Kheru. And our feature today is a rebroadcast. Earlier on, we gave you one, and our second rebroadcast is with Dr. Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. And this was aired on October 7, 2012. But before we get into our feature, I want to say happy birthday. Today would have been Kwame Nkrumah's birthday. He was born September 21, 1909. And he passed on April 27, 1972. And he was from Ghana. And he was a person who led the Gold Coast drive for independence. So happy birthday to Kwame Nkrumah. And it's now time for a rebroadcast. The interview with Dr. Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey.
My very, very special guest is Dr. Dianne Diakite. She is the author of the book 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of a Jamaican Religious Experience. We have been talking about her all morning, and I dare say all over a week and a half since we started reading this book. Dr. Dianne, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
May I just say thank you very much for doing this research?
Thank you.
How long did this take?
Well, I would say about 4.5 years in terms of doing research here and in archives and reading a lot of the secondary literature and primary source material. But then that was the work I did for my dissertation, and then it really took me another, maybe 7 years before I published it as a book.
I don't know. Well, you talked about it in the preface. You wrote about what was the driving force that kind of led you to on this path. But may I just tell you that in reading this book, I read this is one time when I read every single line, because I kind of read very quickly and fast, and I will just ignore a paragraph if I think that it doesn't need to be read. Mm-hmm. But I am reading everything. The footnotes.
Wow.
Honestly,
that's great.
I am really reading everything.
There are a lot of footnotes.
Yeah.
Endnotes, I should say.
So this is brilliant. I've been saying all morning that for me it is one of the most important books that I've ever read, and I think that in this time, this must be one of the most important books for any African Jamaican, for any African wherever we are, in understanding who we are, why we are, and how come.
Thank you.
This is what. So after I've said all of that, now let me go on. So you write in the preface a little bit about the reason for doing this. Tell us about that.
Well, on one level, I mean, I came to this project in the context of the Academy, and as you said, it is written in some senses for the Academy, and I do like the idea of doing something at a later time where I can write something that's more available or accessible to the general public. Mm-hmm. But I did also have the general public in mind, and I'm hoping that many in the general public will at least be able to pick up something from it if they do get a chance to read it. In that sense, I was trained as what we call a liberation theologian. And this was a movement in theological studies that emerged in the last quarter of the 20th century. And I was especially captivated by theological school, Black theology within that. And its sister school, Womanist or Black feminist theology. And I noted this was a global movement. I mean, you could talk about Latin American liberation theology, Caribbean theologies, but I noticed with the Black and Caribbean scholars and even the Latin American theologians, the African experience was somehow eclipsed in the work that they did. Overall, the liberation theologians argued that God favors the oppressed. God sides with the oppressed. And really what they mean is the Christian God. But I didn't see a significant attempt to wrestle with the contradictions in the Christian faith as it related to the African religious heritage. So there was a lot of conversation about racism, about classism, about sexism, but there was not a lot of conversation about religio-cultural oppression. And I felt that it was essential, based on some of the things I was reading, to give another look, a historical look. And so one of the things I tried to argue is that we cannot just do our theologies conceptually from where we stand. We really have to comb back through the pages of history and see what really happened as best as we can. I mean, we weren't there, but we have to do our best. And so on one level, I was trying to address that hiatus in the literature, okay? And in doing that, I discovered that there really was an organic liberation theology that emerged out of the African religious experience that often asserted itself in contention with, because it was forced to be in that position with the colonial Christian perspective. And so I wanted to tell that narrative. I felt it had not been told appropriately.
But to get to that point, what kind of assumptions did you have to kick through the door and get rid of? Because
you're right. Let me say it's very interesting because one of the things I'll never forget is Dr. Leonard Barrett, who's actually from my father's. I don't know if you know his work, but he was really one of the earliest African Jamaicans to do work on the Rastafarians and his other books. He wrote the book The Sun and the Drum. He's from my father's area, St. Elizabeth. Same homestead as my father. He said to me a long time ago, I visited him in Germantown, Pennsylvania, before I came to do some research in Jamaica, and he said, do not let them push you out of theology. He said, that's what they did to me. As soon as I said I wanted to study the African religions, they pushed me into sociology. And to be honest, I was able to have an audience with former Prime Minister Edward Seaga, and he was very suspicious of me initially because he knew I was being theologically trained, and he was thinking that perhaps my goal in doing the work was to denigrate it, coming from a theological perspective.
Well, may I just say to you that in reading the book, I kept waiting for understanding that you were coming from a theological perspective, I kept waiting for you to get back to that place of Jesus, and I kept the white Jesus, and I kept saying, all right, well, I wanted to kind of cheat and go to the conclusion to say exactly what you were going to say there, because this is how that's where our mindsets are, that if you're going to come from a theological perspective, you're not going to be viewing African traditional religions in any kind of positive way.
Yes.
And shockingly, surprisingly,
yes, and it's troubling for some people. But one of the most amazing discoveries in doing the work here, not just here but across the Caribbean and parts of Africa, is the anxiety about the other is very much a Western Christian monotheistic anxiety. It's not an anxiety that indigenous populations have. It's not an anxiety that African populations have had. Their approach to spirituality tends to be one that allows for multiple allegiances, that allows them to see the other, whether it's the other person or the other spirituality, as worthwhile, as worthy of engagement. And that is something that I wanted to also bring out in the text. So even if one goes into this with that perspective, I think if one is true to what the data show, that perspective has to be challenged by a perspective that is open, that is flexible, that sees the value in human spirituality across the board.
Before we talk a little bit more about the book, a little bit about yourself, because here we're going to be talking to a theologian about African traditional religions, and even as I speak, I know that people are kind of getting their minds in a place now to say, okay, Andrea said she didn't go there, so let me sit down and listen to this. So a little bit about yourself. How do you define yourself, even within the context of the research? Is it African-centered consciousness, religious, Eurocentric Christianity? I mean, how do you...
Right. Well, certainly not Eurocentric Christianity. There was a feminist scholar who defined herself as a post-Christian because she couldn't ignore the fact that Christianity had certainly impacted her life. But she had parted so much with so much of the theology that she began to embrace the term post-Christian. Her name was Mary Daly, a very prominent feminist theologian in the United States. In some ways, I feel that term is applicable to me, but I don't really boast anywhere that I'm not a Christian, because if I do that, it really locks me out of having influence in a number of circles. I don't think that's necessary. I'm not even sure that the church and Black people's experiences in the church involve so much more than just the theology that's being preached. I mean, it is sociology, it is theology, it's politics, and I really have no intentions of locking myself out of those kind of circles. But certainly I have been very inspired by the African-centered approach, or African-centered approaches, and really, historically, as it relates to North America, the Caribbean, other parts of the Americas, I really believe, based on what I've seen, based on what I've read, that it really is our African heritage that has liberated us, and we cannot afford to be alienated from it.
Well, one of the things we have done quite a bit in the book. The book, I like the way it's arranged in terms of the chapters. And I was saying to my husband last year, because I read chapter 1 aloud to him, and we were kind of putting it together with Bobby Wright and making all of the connections and saying, yes, this is where you've really pulled it all together for us, giving us more meaning. But there's this chapter on divination. We're going to be talking about the chapters that I was not prepared for.
Yes.
Now, I never know that there was a chapter in a book that I could not have been prepared for. So I was reading, and I find that I was getting quite emotional. So I just got up and went to make some coffee and come back. I said, let me drink some coffee and read again. And then I'm reading again, and I'm getting even more emotional. So I say, okay, I am going to put down divination for a little while and get my mind in the place where I can come back and read this without bawling all over the thing for the pain that I still feel for my ancestors. So, that said, let us talk about how you have arranged the books and the chapters and why.
Right. Interestingly enough, at the dissertation stage, I feel like I really wrote this book at the dissertation stage, though I expanded it a lot beyond the PhD when I was studying for the PhD. Bob Marley, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane got me through the writing of this book. So as you say that, I mean, really, as I was writing, putting the pieces together, organizing the chapter, that music was playing in the background all the time. For some reason, those were the only three, two jazz musicians and Bob Marley.
Yes.
That's what really got got me through. But I deliberately used these more African liturgical, or one might say ritual concepts to organize the book as a way of moving the reader through ritual process, and basically acknowledging that we have a dilemma. Here we are, how many years out of slavery? Over 150 years out of slavery. Now maybe even close to 200 years out of slavery. And we really are struggling with dilemmas that impoverish our spirits, our entire beings. And that's why I start with Engelbert and Vang, the late Cameroonian theologian's concept of anthropological poverty. I love that concept because it doesn't just explain our material poverty, but it explains what theologians would call anthropological poverty, our poverty of being in the world. So that was an important starting point for me. It's not just being deprived of what we have, but of who we are, being deprived of who we are. And so that was a starting point. And when there is a problem to solve in many African religious traditions, one begins with divination. Right? One begins with divination, and all rituals are opened up with libation, some sort of pouring of food, drink. Right? One begins with divination, and all rituals are opened up with libation, some sort of pouring of food, drink to the ancestors.
And just so our listeners know, these are under the headings, the chapters of the book.
So divination is introduction, libation is the chapter 1, incantation, chapter 2, the power of the word. The power of the word for chapter 2. Chapter 3, offering. African rituals are about.
And by the way, excuse me, it was incantation that I had to put the book down. It wasn't divination, it was incantation. Hard. Yes.
Yeah, that one is hard because I have a section on the European denigration of Africanness and African people, and I really try to show how that goes back to quote unquote Greco-Roman times. I look at the anti-Africanness, if not Afrophobia, in the Hebrew and Greek literatures, as well as in the European Enlightenment period, even before the Enlightenment, obviously, and up through the Enlightenment period, and then taking it into some of the Jamaican and Caribbean historians, Brian Edwards and Edward Long, to really show what we were wrestling with, that in many ways, the anti-Africanness, in some cases the Afrophobia that we have internalized, is not African-derived. It's really coming to us through this experience of engaging with European colonizers and the colonial scripts that were bequeathed to us out of that experience. So the incantation, in some ways, there's a play on that, the power of the word, the script, that in some, all scripts have power. And so it's up to us to change the script, to change a word.
And you defined Afrophobia as?
A fear and hatred of things and people African.
And you said that even as Africans, we ourselves have internalized that.
Just because they're African. Now, I don't believe that we should be reluctant to criticize Africa or Africans. Every culture, every society under the sun will need to be critiqued. There's no doubt about it. There's not a lot of that here because I felt that there was so much defensive work to be done. But it doesn't mean that that we should refrain from critiquing, but to dismiss something outright, to be fearful of it outright just because it's African is what I would call Afrophobia.
Afrophobia. It's a new word for this space, Afrophobia. Yes, and so that the chapters are divination, libation, incantation,
offering, very important in African ritual ceremonies, that you offer food and drink to the deities, to the community, to the ancestors. One of the best ways, metaphors for understanding African religions, period, is the metaphor of family. The invisible world domain is an extension of the lived world, the experienced world. It's a world that is experienced by ancestors, by deities, by powers with whom the human visible world attempts to keep the connection, to forge relationships and to keep those relationships strong. So offerings are very important. And then visitation, the visitation of the spirit, that is very much understood to be a blessing in these rituals. And because the spirits come to warn, to admonish, to heal. Healing is so significant in these traditions. and then communion. There is often some sort of sacrifice, just like we have, in the Christian church. The communion is a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of the body and blood of Jesus, the Christ. So there's some sort of sacrifice usually, and the food is cooked and the community partakes of it. So communion is the final chapter of the book. And I'll just say something very interesting, which I was shocked to hear. Dr. Yannick Hume, who graduated from Emory University, I had the pleasure of being on her dissertation committee. She did work on Haitian immigrants in Cuba, and she works on their rituals and their festivals. She's a dancer herself, and she teaches at UWI in Cave Hill, Barbados. And she came back and she visited with me for a long time, about 3 weeks ago in Atlanta. And she told me, she was thanking me profusely for the book, and she said, "You would not believe that your book is the entry point for my students at UWI." And she talks about the students at UWI in Barbados as very different than the students here in Jamaica. That the ones in Barbados, she says, tend to be more Eurocentric in their perspective, a little bit more conservative in their Christian outlook. And so she said, my book tends to be the best portal into the study of the African Caribbean religions. And I was shocked because people see it as, in some ways, too on the margins, too out there, not Christian enough. And she said, no, actually, the kind of theological work that you do, they can understand visitation, because in the sanctified churches, the Spirit comes to visit. So she said, really, it becomes a bridge for them to be able to, for example, look at a voodoo altar, because she does a lot of work with material culture or a Santeria or Lukumi ritual. So that was very surprising to me.
Right, and at that level, this is what you've heard, which you're finding surprising, and I find it that surprising that you find that surprising. But even so, at this level, talking about even the Running African audience, and I'm thinking the Jamaican society as a whole, that this book must be compulsory reading. And I would recommend that for families, and I'm doing that seriously without any kind of flattery. I read this and thought, this is it then. This is a missing link. This is what we've been talking about, and pulling from so many different sources.
Reggae Radio, IRI FM.
It's now 8 o'clock and you're listening to the Running African Show. And if you're just joining, you're listening to a rebroadcast. Yes, the interview with Dr. Diakite. And she's the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey. It's back to a special feature.
So you've put everything together as one, and then
that is what I tried to do. I really, in some ways, there's so much more work to be done, because I really tried to pull a number of sources together and to construct a narrative that would be true to the sources. But there, as you look with each chapter, there's so much more digging that could be done. And I talked about the liberation theology imperative, that we had to talk about a liberation theology that would take seriously the African religious heritage. But besides that, there was also this other problematic in the discipline of particularly the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, that the Anglophone, if I can use that word, or the English-speaking Caribbean, the Protestant Caribbean, so to speak, had not been taken seriously in certain circles, and North America, as having what would be considered significant African retentions, particularly in the area of religion. There was this kind of sense that, okay, well, there's this Obia thing, which is quote-unquote witchcraft. And of course I debunk that. But there was this Obia thing, and then that's it. But all of the African religions really were established in Haiti, Cuba, Brazil. That's really where you need to go if you... So I was trying to also debunk that, hence my listing of the 6 features.
And we want to come back
exactly.
to that. The 6 foundational characteristics of continental African religion, you call it in the book. You're inside of the IRI FM Forum Running African, and we're having a conversation with Dr. Dianne Diakite. She is the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. By the way, this particular book we're talking about is published under the name Dianne M. Stewart. Dianne M. Stewart. So if you're looking for it, find it on the DIANNE M. Stewart, STEWART. So Dan, before we went into the break, the 6 foundational characteristics of continental African religion, you said you actually went there to what? To make that...
Right, because I think the assumption was that if we cannot find the name of an African god, right, if we cannot find the residue of an African god, then there is no African religion. So, for example, in Cuba, you can certainly find the Yoruba deities, the Shango, Oya, Oshun. You can find communities that are practicing these religions, and you can see the similar rituals in Cuba that you would see in Nigeria or Benin. The same thing in Brazil, the same thing in Haiti. So I think the assumption was if we don't have these very conspicuous features that we can directly identify with apparent tradition on the continent, well, they're not really African. And so I really wanted to say that there are other ways to understand the ingenuity. And so I kind of came up with these 6 features as I was doing the work, that the first one being a communotheistic understanding of the divine.
And explain that for us.
Well, I prefer the term communotheistic. It comes from an Igbo, Nigerian scholar of Igbo descent, Okechukwu Ogbonnaya. His book is called On Communitarian Divinity. And I think Rastas and other Christians, others will find this very interesting, because what he does, it's a brilliant thesis. And what he does in that book is show that from the early 2nd century Christian construction of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity. It's a very unique doctrine, but it was constructed by a North African. Tertullian was a North African bishop, and theologians have tended to interpret Tertullian's contributions in terms of his Greek training, but Ogbonnaya recontextualizes Tertullian as a North African and argues that this very strange and peculiar doctrine of 3 in 1 comes out of an African spiritual intelligence. So for him, he compared a number of systems, divine systems, I should say, theological systems, and argued that whether it's 3 gods or 300 gods, the idea of the one and the many is present. And so I think it's a very powerful concept, and I love the way he extends it right into Christianity, claiming Tertullian as an African, which he was. So I like that concept, because I felt that the concepts of monotheism and polytheism had too much baggage. And so we would also ask the question, why do we care so much about those concepts? I mean, I have a colleague who's from Ghana who talks about having translated for Western anthropologists and scholars when they would come to Ghana to the shrines to do work, and he tells a story about one experience where an anthropologist was asking him to ask the priest, a female priest, the head of a particular shrine, how many gods do they believe in? How many gods? And they're talking in Twi, and she says to him, why all of this preoccupation with how many gods? So as a scholar, when we're interested in the insider's perspective, we will note that the number is not important to them, but there is a certain kind of anxiety, I think, from the West, from the Christian West, about how many gods. And so Ogbonnaya argues that there's the one and the many. Both concepts, which might seem dialectic and irreconcilable, are reconciled in in the idea of communal theism. So I prefer that. The divine are a community, their family, the myths about them, how they operate in the invisible domain. They're very much a community. And then the second one is ancestral veneration, which is not too difficult to explain. A kind of regard for the ancestors. In some cases, we're looking at the feeding of the ancestors, and I understand that there are traditions here in Jamaica where that was happening and might even still be happening. The third, I don't know how I listed them, but the third might be
possession, trance, and mediumship.
Yeah, and I'm even using the word manifestation now. I'm doing some writing a book on Trinidad, and I love the concept of manifestation, because I think possession, trance it's the academic term, but the idea of the visitation of the spirits. Yes. That seems to be central. It's not that these features are unique to Africans. I mean, there are many other indigenous religions where these might be present, and even forms of Christianity, right? And even Islam, forms where these features might be present, even if not in the official version, in the version that's happening on the ground, in the lived religion.
And just as we remind our listeners that what you're doing here is pointing out to the 6 characteristics of continental African religion, in terms of giving us a better understanding of how to identify whether or not there's a retention of African traditional religions here in Jamaica outside of how it's normally done.
Right. That's what I'm trying. And then I think I talked about divination, food offerings and animal sacrifice, divination and herbalism, and a pervasive belief in, I would like to always say, neutral mystical power. Yeah, that's how I will say it. Neutral mystical power.
All right. So then, in laying this out, you have then looked at the Jamaican context and have identified these characteristics in practices here in Jamaica which might not have been identified initially as religious practices. And you spend a lot of time talking about, in the book, about Obia in particular and Mile. So let's talk about those two, which you said there is the separation that we know today of, Obia as being one thing, Mile being another thing, really isn't how it was in the originally.
It appears so. It appears so. Okay, so we are always hampered by the fact that our own ancestors' voices were principally written out of history. We're often looking at sources that were compiled by Europeans, residents of the islands, visitors to
I'm going to interrupt you, Dianne, because we're getting a feedback sound, so let me just do this and come back, and I'll fix it and come right back. No problem. All right, we're inside of the IRFM Forum Running African. 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of a Jamaican Religious Experience. The author is Dr. Dianne Diakite. The book is published on the Dianne store. Interesting enough, let me just say to the persons who are already responding on Facebook and Twitter and so on, thank you very much, and we'll get as many of your questions in as possible, because she's coming back at 9 o'clock right after sports, and that time we'll open the phone lines and you can ask your questions, make your comments, and so on. In the meantime, we'll try and read as many of the comments as possible. But we had interrupted Dr. Dianne talking to us about the 6 foundational characteristics of a continental African religion, and then identifying those characteristics here in African-centered practices, which we hadn't initially identified, possibly until now, as African religions. And 2 in particular we're starting with, Obia and Mile. Dianne, tell us about that.
Okay, thank you again for having me. Well, the first person I ever heard mention the word Mile was Professor Bobby Hill, and I was in college at the time at Colgate University in New York, and he came to give a lecture on Rastafari, and I had never heard this term before, and I thought, how is that possible? I mean, I know I didn't grow up in Jamaica, but I just couldn't believe what he was talking about, and he was tracing the legacy of Mile in Jamaica right up through to the Rastafari tradition. He was connecting the philosophy of Mile to all of the traditions, Native Baptist, Revival, Rastafari. And I couldn't believe it. And so I began to do some work on it and realized that, yes, this actually does exist. Everybody, of course, knows the infamous reputation of Obia. So Obia becomes criminalized in the colonial record, for sure. At the foundation of nearly, if not all, revolts, the colonial establishment would find that there was a very powerful ritual, perhaps it differed from time to time, but which was given the name of the Obia Oath, which swore combatants to follow through on their promises, on their loyalty, on their confidentiality in striking against the slave system.
Reiterate that, because it might miss us. You're saying that at the center of a slave uprisings and revolts, that it would begin to appear after some time that Obia was at the center.
Absolutely, and honestly, scholars like Monica Schuler have said it was Gordon Lewis who, or is it Lewis Gordon? I'm forgetting now. The Caribbean historian who actually wrote at the foundation of every slave revolt. I mean, I thought that was and he's a well-respected historian. I thought that was really interesting, and I certainly found that at the ones that I looked at for Jamaica.
What is very common in Jamaica is the 1760
Kaki revolt.
Yes. That is in the narrative here in Jamaica about the use of Obia,
and it becomes very significant because because that is the revolt that really led to the colonial establishment taking obeah seriously as a threat. Really taking it very seriously.
But taking it seriously as a threat doesn't necessarily mean that it's a religion.
No. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't necessarily say that. But what I was able to identify is that, and I could, in some ways we're theorizing, but based on what I've read, what I believe was happening is that the colonial establishment was looking at these practices and collectively dismissing them as obeah. So if we look at, for example, the feature of neutral mystical power and being able to tap into it, that there is a power in the universe that we can tap into and access and deploy. And that power is neutral. Now, how we use it and the intentions with which we use it might raise ethical questions. But that's one of the reasons I argue that obeah has to be looked at, because if our ancestors were resorting to obeah to fight slavery, I cannot personally look at that as evil. So I talk about the weaponry warfare. I don't do it here, but now as I'm continuing to theorize it, it's not in the book, but I've talked about the weaponry warfare repertoire. I look at obeah as having repertoires that might have to do with policing and judgment, might have to do with weaponry and warfare, health and healing. So I like to look at obeah as a much more protean institutional structure. And you can even see in Jamaicans, even a lot of Jamaicans will refer to obeah very negatively. But if you start to have an extended conversation, you'll hear somebody talk about somebody being healed by some obeah person. So we use it in contradictory ways as well. And I prefer to say that obeah has its various repertoires. And if we have more of a hemispheric perspective, it helps us, because the Guyanese, the Surinamese, they are very shocked when they come to conferences and meet people from other parts of the Caribbean and who are saying this is evil or witchcraft. For them, obeah, and they use the same word, obeah, that's the priest, that's the healer. And so when you go back and read some of these historians who are writing, like Edward Long wrote extensively about Tacky's revolt in his history of Jamaica. I mean, it's very difficult to argue that this is not a religious ceremony going on. It's very difficult to argue that this is just about deploying quote-unquote magic. That might be a part of it.
So you're saying that obeah was somehow condensed into, in later years, into just, and even though the enslavers viewed it as one thing, as magic, poison, and as a result was dismissed.
I believe so.
There was a lack of understanding as to what this was.
I believe so. I believe that what they're describing as obeah across the centuries probably involves some practices as that we would describe as quote-unquote magical or mystical, but probably involves broader ritual practices as well. And it could have been that different nations were, asserting their religious traditions in one camp, or maybe Pan-Africanizing them in another. But a lot of that just gets wrapped up into the label obeah. And then obeah changes over time, right? It changes in later centuries. But I think for the slave period, it is very difficult to limit obeah to a kind of deployment of mystical or magical power. I think that's a part of it, and that's the part that in many ways becomes most useful for resisting the colonial forces. So that's what seems most prominent.
So as a religion, what would obeah be? How would it have manifested, if manifested?
Reggae Radio, Irie FM.
Hey guys, welcome back. It's now 20 minutes after 8, and gotta remind you once again that coming your way at 8:30 will be the live draw for top draw. Dollars, pick 2, pick 3, pick 4, and cash pot, the early bird draw. You're listening to the Running African. DJ Chris sitting in on behalf of Kabu, Mahat, Kheru, and our special feature is a rebroadcast with Dr. Dianne Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey.
As a religion, what would obeah be? How would it have manifested, if manifested?
I cannot say that I've read materials that give us those kinds of details. But what I can say is that, for example, I'm reading between the lines. Edward Long will say, when they assemble, this is literally what he says. He's describing what happened before Tacky's revolt. When they assemble for the purposes of war, with the Obia priest. So what that tells me is that they are assembling for other purposes. They're not just assembling for the purposes of war. They're coming together for other kinds of rituals as well. Do you see my point?
Yes.
He'll talk about, the rituals that they'll do, the singing of the songs and particular movements and what have you. So I'm assuming, just based on what we have, that we have to have some sort of dance involved, some sort of invocation involved, some sort of priest involved, and for me those signs would indicate religion. It's not that we have any full-fledged description of Obia as a religion the way we would understand it today in many cases, and really as a religion scholar I can tell you that we understand religion as beyond what we typically call religion. That which religion comes from the Latin word religare, that which binds people together. Some people say religion is the center of one's ultimate concern, which is why some scholars will even go as far as saying soccer is a religion. The dance hall is a religion. It's what binds people together.
In saying, and in that context, where would Obia fall? Because I don't want a confusion in the minds of our listeners. Is that saying soccer is a religion and dance hall is a religion? Is it the same way we're saying Obia is a religion?
Based on what I have seen, I would say that I cannot imagine that what they were describing as Obia, the colonial empire, what they were describing as Obia did not involve what rituals that we would consider to be religious, communicating with the divine, prayer, devotion. I would be surprised. It doesn't mean that the people themselves were naming it Obia. I mean, traditionally, it's not that, it doesn't make sense, to an African traditionally to go around naming their religion, right? People they live in relationships.
Religion was a livity.
That's right. People, it's not that it's their goal to really go around naming something. This is my religion. That's a very new concept. But it is difficult for me to believe that was not going on. It's not that we have full-fledged descriptions of it, but reading between the lines, I have to assume that. Another reason I have to assume it is because before the Mayo outbreak of 1842, the descriptions that we have always link Mayo with Obia. There are many descriptions of just Obia, but the descriptions that I'm seeing of Mayo link it to Obia, which is very interesting.
Hold that point. We're going to come right back to that point.
When we lose our African connection, we lose our royal connection. When we disconnect ourselves from Africa, we cease to be a world people. Without the African connection, we are a disjointed people, begging for the entry into somebody else's house.
Words of Dr. John Henry Clark, this spoken by Mama Tendai. You're inside of the RFM Forum, Running Africa, and my very, very special guest this morning is Dr. Dianne Diakite, and she's the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. Very interesting discussion we're having, and the responses on social media also finding this really, really interesting. Dr. Dianne, so then now we're talking at this point about that connection between Nile and Obia. So you're saying in 1842, you said?
Yes, there was a Nile outbreak in Trelawney, parts of Trelawney and St. James. And it appears that many historians since that period have always read that division between Obia and Nile back into the historical record. So most scholarly texts that one reads will say that Obia was bad magic or evil magic and Nile was good magic, because that's what the colonial rulers, missionaries were saying. That's really what was in the record. But if I went back as far as I could to try to look at any descriptions of them, and I kind of chart them at one point in the book. And what I found was the separation of the two only began to emerge after that 1842 outbreak. So before that, it's really interesting. So for example, I'm just looking here at page 47 where I'm citing Edwards, and he says the Obia ceremony. So once you say ceremony, right? Something is happening there. Always commence with what is called by the Negroes the Mayo dance. That in itself is very interesting to me, because it raises the question: why is he describing that as obia? Right? Is it that they themselves understood the two to be connected, meaning the Africans themselves? But I don't think that we can dismiss that question. The fact that, and there are others that are always associating the two traditions. So I felt that needed to be explored to some degree. And even though, like Monica Schuler will talk about the Mayo participation in different uprisings and what have you, I haven't seen personally anything that directly says Mayolists did this. But we know that Mayolists were very much involved with the Native Baptist religion. So in terms of the Sam Sharp Rebellion, that becomes very, very important. But it's not that I've seen any record that says Mayolists were responsible for this particular rebellion. But definitely obia will be implicated. I find it hard to believe that if the enslaved population understood what they were doing as obia, I find it very hard to believe that the two representatives of each tradition were not in some way cooperating. It's hard to know, because on one level I believe that the colonial external observers were labeling everything obia. And they probably heard this Mayo word and said, oh, okay, when they get together and do their obia thing, there's this thing called the Mayo dance. So Mayo does emerge in the 1760s in the literature. So the earliest rendering, the earliest naming of Mayo that I've been able to find is in Thistlewood's diary entries. And he talks about, in 1868, he talks about a Mayo man who was hanged, who was burned to death, and his wife was hanged. And then a year later, he talks about his mistress's daughter holding a Mayo dance, and talks about who attended the dance. And then 2 weeks later, he finally reprimands her for it. So that's the earliest I've seen. So we know that there is this thing, this movement, this community called Mayo. The difference is Mayo specifically is talked about in the
And you're listening to a rebroadcast interview with Dr. Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey. We're going to take a break. On the flip side, we will continue this interview.
Irie FM.
Hey, Goddess, welcome back. You're listening to the Running African Show. It's now 8:34. DigiChris sitting in on behalf of Kabu Mahat Kheru. And our special feature is a rebroadcast interview with Dr. Diakite. And she's the author of the 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. And this was aired on October 7th, 2012. It's now time to rejoin that interview.
Will be implicated. I find it hard to believe that if the enslaved population understood what they were doing as obia, I find it very hard to believe that the two representatives of each tradition were not in some way cooperating. It's hard to know, because on one level I believe that the colonial external observers were labeling everything obia. And they probably heard this Mayo word and said, oh, okay, when they get together and do their obia thing, there's this thing called the Mayo dance. So Mayo does emerge in the 1760s in the literature. So the earliest rendering, the earliest naming of Mayo that I've been able to find is in Thistlewood's diary entries. And he talks about, in 1868, he talks about a Mayo man who was hanged, who was burned to death, and his wife was hanged. And then a year later, he talks about his mistress's daughter holding a Mayo dance, and talks about who attended the dance. And then 2 weeks later, he finally reprimands her for it. So that's the earliest I've seen. So we know that there is this thing, this movement, this community called Mayo. The difference is Mayo specifically is talked about in the record as some sort of religious gathering. They do tend to, even though they'll still dismiss dismiss it as involving fetishism or involving idolatry or what have you, but they do describe it in a way that it's clear that these are groups of people coming together to do something.
And so that in the connection between Mayal and Obia, bearing in mind all of what you just said, your conclusion would be what? That these two are part and parcel of a bigger religious experience.
Exactly, a religious world sense that is available to Africans, and I think that they became kind of the symbols, the portals, the passageway to African spirituality. And it's hard to know exactly what their insider terms were for everything. We know that Mayal was one of them. It's hard to totally know how they were using Obia. For I think another important hemispheric connection to make is the research of Jerome Handler and Kenneth Bilby in Barbados. And I love their thesis actually, because when we look at how many Biafrans, people from the Biafra area of Nigeria really came to the Caribbean and to North America, it's astonishing. Even I ran the numbers before I came here, and for Jamaica, out of 739,000, 623 enslaved Africans for the entire period of, let's look at when they're first coming, from 1651 to some are even coming as late as 1857. Out of the 739,000, 229,000 plus were coming from the Bight of Biafra and Gulf of Guinea Islands. So it's really interesting. There, I have a kind of Chui Akan thesis that Obia comes from the term obeye, which signifies neutral mystical power, and they're words to also indicate when someone is using it negatively or positively. But Jerome Handler and Kenneth Bilby argue that it's, or at least they posit that it comes from the Ibibio term dibia, which means doctor, healer, priest, obia dibia. It's a very interesting connection that they're making from Barbados. And we also know that Jamaica received its earliest shipment of enslaved Africans under the British from Barbados. They were coming in from Barbados. So those theses, and also the fact that in Guyana it really is seen as a healing tradition makes it very difficult for me to just see Obia as this one thing, at least for the slave period. I feel strongly, reading in between the lines, that there was more of a connection between Obia and Mayal, and Obia probably some Africans, but what becomes most prominent is the weaponry and warfare repertoire, because that was what was most public and most problematic for the establishment.
We want to talk now about how did Obia then become criminalized and the processes that led to that.
Speak truth to the people. To identify the enemy is to free the mind. Free the mind of the people. Speak to the mind of the people. Speak truth.
We're back with you. It's the IRFM Forum, Running African, as we talk about Dr. Dianne Diakite's book, 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. The research highly relevant to us as a people. All right, just under 15 minutes in this segment before we break for news and sports, Dr. Dianne. So let us look now at the criminalization of Obia and so on in the African traditional religions. You talk about the anti-Africanness and how Obia and Mayal, Obia in particular, became criminalized, the process. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So Taki's revolt is very important in thinking about this criminalized history. After Taki's revolt in 1760, the planters really had to take it seriously as a source of religious inspiration. Not just there's poison involved here, but this is a serious tradition that is able to unify and inspire the Africans. And so there were a lot of laws passed, whether mentioning the term Obia or mentioning materials that might be used by Obia practitioners to suppress Obia in the 1700s, 1760s, 1780s. Laws were passed to suppress Obia and to criminalize Obia. Laws were often passed also against drumming writing, music. So that gives you an indication that something religious is probably going on.
Well, this is one of the times that I had to put the book down and walk, because, even to this day, that there are quite a few churches in Jamaica in which the drum is banned, in which you can't, if you're Christian, you can't dance. You have to suppress that natural Africanness in order to be identified as a Christian.
I found diaries, documents where missionaries, and the missionaries are very tricky, because I think in many ways Jamaicans have been taught to honor them and to really appreciate what they brought in terms of education and religion. But it's troubling for me as a liberation theologian to do that, and for these reasons. They really complied with the requirement to accommodate the plantation economy and slavery. Theologically, they really reinforced to the Africans that what happens to your material body now on earth, it's not really that important. Your souls are much more important to God. Now, the radical message in what they brought was that their souls were equal to the souls of anyone else. And to be fair, they really did teach that, that your soul is no less worthy than anyone else. But to separate the body from the soul in a place where you are a commodity, you are a commodity to be gifted, sold, willed away to others, auctioned, what have you, really it speaks to a colonial Christianity. And, they were often suppressed by the planters as well. I mean, they didn't really get licenses to be able to do their work until the first decade and a half or so of the 19th century. So they were contending with a lot themselves, being suppressed, not having access to enslaved Africans or limited access, and constantly under suspicion by the planters. And I think all the more that would make them comply with the wishes of the planters to create good slaves for us. So theologically, that becomes very problematic for me, because it is a colonial theology. And in some of the work I've done, I have found a couple things which I think you'll find interesting, because one I don't talk about as much here. They would even complain at times about the style of singing. Like we have to literally rid these Africans of this grotesque and barbaric singing. We have to train their voices to literally sing our hymns the way we like to have them sung. So when we talk about a Eurocentric project, I mean, even to the extent of the way the Africans would sing was grotesque to them. So you see that. The other thing that you do see, which
it begins to make a lot of sense.
Yes.
Listening to the Moravian and the Anglican and the Catholic churches in Jamaica and so on, and the style of singing, that this is very European.
Yes.
In how, but that makes a lot of sense now. All right. So you're saying the other thing
is that just even broadly speaking, you will find missionary journals that speak extensively about the indigenous religion among the indigenous people. They'll, on Thomas Coke's journals, he does talk in one of his volumes extensively about the native people's beliefs and the Zemi spirits. I just haven't had time to really work on that or do anything, but there are extensive chapters devoted to that.
Reggae Radio, IRE FM.
You're listening to our rebroadcast interview with Dr. Dianne Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey. And it's now 8:45, and it's time for news. News comes your way next.
While driving through Jamaica, there's only one radio station I listen to. IRE FM, IRE FM, IRE FM, IRE FM.
It's now 8:58, and you're listening to the Running African Show. Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're just joining, it's really good to have you. DJ Chris sitting in studio for Kabo, Kheru. And our special feature this morning is a rebroadcast of the interview with Dr. Dianne Diakite, and she's the author of the book 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. And it was aired on October 7th, 2012. And it's now time to rejoin that feature.
in some of the work I've done, I have found a couple things which I think you'll find interesting, because one I don't talk about as much here. They would even complain at times about the style of singing. Like we have to literally rid these Africans of this grotesque and barbaric singing. We have to train their voices to literally sing our hymns the way we like to have them sung. So when we talk about a Eurocentric project, I mean, even to the extent of the way the Africans would sing was grotesque to them. So you see that. The other thing that you do see, which
begins to make a lot of sense.
Yes.
Listening to the Moravian and the Anglican and the Catholic churches in Jamaica and so on, and the style of singing, that this is very European.
Yes.
In how, but that makes a lot of sense now. All right. So you're saying the other thing
is that just even broadly speaking, you will find missionary journals that speak extensively about the indigenous religion among the indigenous people. They'll, on Thomas Coke's journals, he does talk in one of his volumes extensively about the native people's beliefs in the Zemi spirits. I just haven't had time to really work on that or do anything, but there are extensive chapters devoted to that. I found even documents of missionaries, not just in Jamaica and other places, but I found one in particular in Jamaica, and it doesn't come to me now because I put it down in a file, talking to Muslim slaves, about their beliefs. There's one of a pretty extensive dialogue between a European missionary in the 1800s in Jamaica and a Muslim slave talking about their ideas of God. But you don't find any such interest in the indigenous African religions that they brought. And in fact, they weren't even considered religion. They were considered the opposite of. So I think Obia becomes criminalized, particularly because they found the Obia Oath very, very significant.
The Obia Oath.
That the combatants would take very significant in these revolts. There's also the connection of Obia with poison, having knowledge of points and of plants, botanical properties. And we know that with any medicine, even today in Western medicine, all medicine can be healing or poison, depending on how it's taken. I mean, medications are very dangerous substances as well, right? As well as substances that can heal. And so we do see those kind of powers being attributed to Obia priests, Obia specialists, the knowledge of the botanical properties of plants and how to use them. And so there was a lot of fear.
So in the criminalization of Obia, the possession of these plants would have been banned. You could not be seen with poisons then. And if plants were considered poisonous, then, What was some of the other stuff that were banned?
Well, definitely drumming and music and gathering. For example, in the early 1800s or 1816, there was an act that allowed for amusement on the properties. Because the abolitionist movement was in force in England, and people were advocating to at least ameliorate, including some of the missionaries, ameliorate the conditions, the harsh conditions on the properties that enslaved Africans had to endure, and so there was an act that they could have amusement, but only up until a certain time. And
curfew.
Curfew, and then other legislation that they couldn't meet together. They couldn't meet and teach one another, which is why the missionaries, probably didn't even realize that they were offering a very important structure for Africans to organize when they had access to their kind of leadership structure to organize. And when we think about the Sam Sharp Rebellion, how important that network was for organizing people in preparation for a strike/rebellion. So the gathering was banned, certain drumming, certain types of horns and shells were banned, because they knew that they would use those musical instruments to actually communicate scripts to one another, instructions and what have you.
And I know where even broken glasses.
Oh, yes. Broken glass, anything like that.
Red thread bags.
Yes. That's right.
Interestingly.
And it's true that I'm sure, and this is what makes it difficult. It's so tricky. When a religious institution has the backing of the nation and has the backing of institutional finances, it can develop and flourish. But when it doesn't, and so the missionary churches became those institutions that offered a lot of opportunities for enslaved Africans and then newly freed Africans, right?
And then at the same time, you're right that even within these missionary churches, the Eurocentric missionary churches, that the foundation, the premise upon how they view their ontology, you talk about Africans, inferior to be the heathen, to be converted. So even while they were, on the missionary work, so to speak, the place they're coming from a place of anti-Africanness, of bigotry and prejudice and so on.
The conversion was a conversion into the new Eurocentric way of life, worldview. Certainly, I mean, let's face it, some Africans accepted Christianity, and we saw that in the native Baptist churches. Of course, the African American Baptists were very important in that.
We want to talk about the native Baptist church. We have so much to talk about. We're going to open the phone lines right after you come back, and then what we want to do is hope that our listeners, putting so many of the questions that we want to ask you here, because we want to go into discussions on the native Baptist church, but we also want to make this interactive. So thank you very much, Dr. Dianne, and we'll see you right after news and sports. All right, so wow, you have to get the book. It's serious business. We are just skimming the surface. There's so much more in Dr. Dianne's book, 3 Eyes for the Journey. It's her research, her dissertation actually, African Dimensions of a Jamaican Religious Experience. But just to tell you, find a copy of this book. You're gonna have to find a copy of this. Read it to yourself, read it to your partners, read it to your children, read it to your husband, read it to your wife, read it at your church, read it to your communities. Have conversations about it. Take it to the pastor and say, how come? Read it and ask your pastors some questions. These are some very, very, very serious research material for African people in this time. It brings it all together, answers the question Dr. Diakite has pulled from so many sources in terms of the research to bring us to this place, 3 Eyes for the Journey. You can't afford not to get a copy of this book. Dr. Dianne Diakite talking about 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. The book is written under the name Dianne Stewart, if you're looking for that. Someone has been kind enough to post it on Facebook for me on my page, so the information is there, even the ISBN number. I mean, our Facebook listeners are very, very active.
Be sure it's the soft cover.
The soft cover
is usually $35 online. It's cheaper.
Okay, than the hard cover. We're also going to be opening the telephone lines right now at 974-5079, 5051, 5043, and 1-888-991-4152 to take your telephone calls. We're taking your tweets. So follow me at Andrea Williams G on Twitter. We're taking a Facebook post, Andrea Williams, that's where I am on Facebook, and we're taking your telephone call. We're also taking your emails at andrea.williams@irfm.net. We go to a text first from Muta Baruka, because Muta is making a comment on the very last thing we spoke about. He says, Obia is a doing used for a given outcome, either good or bad, used by Africans, not a religion. All the leaders of rebellions were practitioners, even if they were seen as Christians.
I mean, that can work for me. That can work for me. I think I am, as I said, I'm reading between the lines, and perhaps in terms of what Obia has become today, his comment might be more appropriate. But for the slave period, I'm not sure that some of what was being described as Obia or connected with Obia did not involve religion. I am more inclined to say that it did, actually.
And then to go back to the 6 characteristics that you identified of the African-centered religion, or the continental African religions, were you able to see these? And you've said that in the practices that have come to be known as Obia, titled Obia by the enslavers.
Yes, definitely the mystical power, but also the gathering for ceremonies. I mean, what's the gathering about? the gathering for ceremonies, the centrality of a priest. Now, the other thing that Obia practitioners are also connected with is working rituals around the silk cotton tree, particularly restoring someone to health, the health and healing repertoires as well. So, typically in African context, those abilities, having expert knowledge and the authority to govern in those areas is associated with some sort of initiation.
Can we underestimate our own psychic trauma in how we view our African religious experiences? I noticed that you said in the book, Africans had to equate all of their inherited traditions with a sinful past if they were to convince the missionaries of their authentic conversion to Christ.
Right. Absolutely. And then by the end of slavery, 25% of the population pretty much is African born, and then a few generations after that, it's going to change. So the loss of memory at a time when the missionary church is becoming very popular among persons of African heritage certainly also distances us from that past. However, the reintroduction of Africans through the British settlement program of liberated Africans probably revitalized in many ways a number of the communities, which is how Kumina ends up in Jamaica and the Etu traditions in the northwestern region of Jamaica. So I think that program, with Africans coming to Jamaica between 1841 and 1867 as liberated Africans, liberated from slave ships en route to Cuba and Brazil, that effort also almost injected into Jamaica another cultural inheritance from particularly Yoruba, Benin, and Congo, Central Africa.
I really do hope that in this program we'll get to, because it is an extensive research. There's a lot there on the Native Baptists, which we have to talk about, on Kumina, on Rastafari, and also on Revival Zion. I hope that even through some of the questions we can get to that. Hello, caller. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First, I would like to ask you, Rastafari has shown black people and all of the color, class, and race and creed the way, the truth, and the light. Likewise, Marcus Garvey and the singers have been singing it in songs over the years, like Muta, Bob Marley, Burning Spear, Sabatooth, and many others. Tell me, why is it black people find it so hard to unite themselves, knowing that the white man unite themselves, we see how the Chinese them unite themselves, we see how the Japanese them unite themselves in a way that all for one and one for all. But when it come on to the black people, they find it so difficult.
All right, Sabatooth, I'm going to ask you to hang up and we ask Dr. Dianne to respond. Yes, go ahead.
I wish I had the answer to that. I think, a couple of things. I do think that the psychic and the spiritual impoverishment that we have suffered as a result of slavery and colonialism is still very much lingering, is still very much with us. But also, I think we shouldn't romanticize the slave period in Africa during that period. I mean, we had Africans coming here from different societies and even within particular societies from different, sometimes caste. Some would have already known the experience of slavery, certainly not the kind of chattel slavery, meaning capital property-based slavery that they experienced here, but some would have even known the experience of slavery. So you have a lot of diversity. You have the establishment of wars and quote-unquote tribal wars or ethnic wars in Africa for the purpose of even feeding the slave trade and slavery. So there's a lot of division even there from the beginning, and we often talk about the enslaved Africans as a community. They weren't always communities. I mean, there was a lot of tension and conflict, etc. So and oppression, structured oppression of that kind. I think it takes a long time to get over. We just can't get over that overnight. So,
but even before the experience of the Western Africa and the transatlantic trade in Africans, if we're going back all the way to Kemet, say to Egypt, I mean, we were communities.
Oh no, I'm not saying that we weren't, but what I'm saying is that I think sometimes the picture that we give or are given is that we were harmoniously living together, then slavery disrupted us, and how can we harmoniously live together again? I mean, even if we deal with Kemet, we have to deal with the slavery that allowed for the building of the pyramids.
We have debunked on this program, which we have debunked time and time on this program, that because in the experience and in the research of the Pan-African scholars, there is no evidence of, say, Jews enslaved and building.
Certainly not Jews. Certainly not Jews. Yeah, but there's definitely stratification. Okay. And the lower classes are building, the servants are building. So we all have to wrestle with this and this history. And even the very quote unquote glorification of Kemet. I mean, it's important. Don't get me wrong, and it's important to rescue the mythology, to rescue Kemet from the mythology of it being somehow some sort of Eurocentric civilization. But we have to get in touch with those very deep underlining philosophies. For example, my husband is a playwright and a novelist, and he's done some work on the Mandingo Empire, which was founded to actually fight the slave trade. And that story doesn't usually come out about Sundiata. People know him as the Lion King. But one of the things that they did through the Dozo hunters, that particular caste, because they were based on caste systems which allowed anybody to join them, to initiate in that caste, was they came up with a Mandingo charter, which was, I mean, if you look at it today, it looks like, any constitution that you might see someplace else. So we have to get in touch with the philosophical foundations of what built African societies and find a way to have a renaissance. That's what Europe did. I mean, the British were not Greeks. The British were not, didn't have anything to do with the Romans. But when they had their Renaissance, they claimed those people as their ancestors, right? These were not their ancestors, but they had a Renaissance. They looked into their deep principles of democracy. They appropriated these Greek and Roman heritage traditions for themselves and claimed it. So I do think that that's what some people are doing with Kemet, but it requires, first of all, a love for ourselves, and to be able to implement that love through structures of governance, good governance, and social organization.
Let's go back to
it requires leadership.
Let's go back to the phone lines. Hello, caller. Good morning. Welcome to Running African.
Yes, good morning, Andrea, again. This is Jamoke.
Yes, Jamoke, yeah.
And as an initiated Yoruba priest, I just thought I'd probably lend some insight to add to the whole situation of Obi. Because in the Yoruba tradition, the system Ifa, which is the highest form of divination, the tool that is used, and this is where you consult with God, is known as the Obis, Obi. In also the Congolese tradition, the Titi Congo, Palo Mayombe, it's the Obi as well that is used as a divinatory tool. It's similar, I like to say to people, it's like in the Bible where they talk about casting lots, which is where they were asking God. So in our tradition, we use the Obis to consult with God as to what is supposed to happen. And in my visits to Cuba, one of the things that I've noticed is that when we consult the oracle, we say, and you ask the Obis, then usually immediately after you ask the question, people will say, Obi, yeah, meaning, so it's like you're saying Obi and you say, yeah, yes. And so in my own understanding, this Obi, as a white man, as people listening off, you would have heard the two and not understanding what is going on. So then the term Obia. Now, in the Congolese tradition, you have Lukung Kansa, who's the devil, and you have Darabando, which is the deity, the spirit that deals with the god of war, the god of metal, the god of destruction and accident. Because in our tradition, it's all energy. It can be used positively or it can be used negatively. Right. And we must remember that also the last set of people that came to Jamaica were indeed from the Congo. One set came to St. Thomas. Thus we have the Kumina, which is also a part of this whole Congolese.
What is interesting, Dorrit, is that in the book, Dr. Dianne, you really spend a lot of time talking about that, the Congolese connection, talk about the etymology of Obi, and also talk about just the very same things that you have discussed here. And that's why I think it's really important that we do get a copy of this book. It really connects us back and forward to ourselves. So the point she's making,
let me just say thank you, caller, for that point. And what's interesting about Obi, there are definitely at least 3 divinatory systems in the Yoruba tradition: the Obi, the Merindilo-gun, and the Ifa. And what's interesting about Obi is that, and you're right, and they use them across at different times. Obi is often a yes/no answer, and it would have been something that could have been easily preserved under the conditions of slavery, whereas Ifa might have been much harder to preserve. So I find that very interesting, because it's as powerful. I mean, it is the oracle for the devotees, but it is a simpler form of divination, which probably would have been easier to retain.
Right, because
Dory, can I just
who uses the not the Dilagoon, the other one. But
I have to interrupt because I do have to go to a break. So sorry about that, Dory. Very sorry about that. And thank you very much, Dory, as usual.
Okay, thank you.
Running African, reuniting the African family for development.
Back with you, and straight to the telephone lines at 974-5079, 5051, 5043, and 1-888-991-4152. Those are the numbers to call if you wish to participate in the discussion this morning. Hello, caller. Good morning. It's Running African.
Good morning.
Hey, Sister Minnie.
Hi, my sister. Your voice so different.
You too.
My heart just jumping inside me when I hear the program,
Yes.
And I just want to give a little piece, if I can, dear. But I hold on so long that my money run out.
Oh, wow. So you
I call them and I'll treat the quick call.
Okay, all right. Go ahead.
Right now, you're on the air?
Yes, you're on air now.
Okay. I want to say greetings to my sister for bringing such good tidings to us this morning, you know. And my spirit rejoices in me when I hear you talk of it. But I just want to give my little part of it because I've been in Africa and I go right to the roots to find out, you know, about the spirit that took me there. And I found out that, you know, when you talk about Maya, this is something that takes us into the spirit world. When we leave our body, and we're going to the spirit world and bring back messages or medicine or warning, you know. And we know that Hobia is symbols and signs still communicating with the spirit world. And not everybody will know it. They will just hear the name, but they won't understand what it is, because it is an experience. And it's a wonderful thing that connects us to our ancestors.
So, Sister Minnie, because so basically, just listening to the discussion this morning, I know you don't have the book yet and you need to get a copy, but just listen to it. You can write your own too, I'm quite sure, as you have been doing.
I have my own experience.
Yeah, I know, but just listening to the discussion this morning, basically what this is doing for you is actually just confirming what you have been experiencing, what you yourself have been talking about. Yeah.
So beautiful. And I know that it would come through one of the daughters, because that's where the spirit really abode, you know. And that's where we have to reveal what is in our guts, what we know, because we couldn't make it without the spirit world, we as the mothers of Africa. So thank you this morning, and I hope our brothers and sisters are connecting to what you say. You see the drum could kill, it could heal, it can still kill, heal, and make alive. You hear me? I see make old ladies who cannot walk for months and years get up and dance like a young teenager. And when the drum stop play, they sit down back and go on back in their 100 and their 90 years. I see drum heal people. I take my eyes, it heals me. It takes me there too. The drum is a connection that takes you into Maya, take you into the ancestor world connection. A lot of people are not beating it. One at a time, you know, all in America, They say if they hear a slave beating the drum, they must chop off his hand. Because when we used to play the drum in its rightful place, it used to kill slave master, man. You hear me? They hear whole heap of horses are ride and the house up in the night. Yes, we call in the spirit of the ancestors, the herbs. You know, the ancestors show us the herbs that must use. Not by physical men. We bring back herbs from different places, from different parts of the universe, come back into this universe to heal each other. That's why, you know, the herb is the healing of the nation.
We're going to leave it there and just let our sister know that in the beginning of this discussion of African spirituality, that you were actually in the studio as one of the first persons who we talked to on this very same topic, looking at African spirituality. Because now, you know, understanding this even within the context of the research, I think it's helping really to broaden the perspectives of so many others who hear the practitioners come in, talk about their experiences, but doubt that without the research, because you know how our people stay. All right.
Yes, so we are not supposed to afraid of. We as black people are not supposed to be afraid of this thing, Obi, because our father is Obadiah. You know, we are from the black world, yeah, and we use magic like herbs, sacrifice. The church uses it too. That's why he have so much people underneath his control. But we don't use it. We are supposed to use it to empower ourselves.
So we're going to leave it there. Thanks as usual.
Thank you, and thank you, sister, for being here.
Thank you.
You're listening to a rebroadcast interview with Dr. Dianne, Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey. We'll be right back. Oh yeah, got us to welcome back. It's now 9:29, and if you're just joining, you're listening to a special feature. It's a rebroadcast interview with Dr. Dianne Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimension of the Jamaica Religious Experience, and it was aired on October 7, 2012. So it's back to that feature.
Sister Nana Isiboa.
Can I just comment on something very quickly? I mean, just thinking about the Congo influence, one of the things that shocked me in doing this research is how much Congo kept coming up. I was shocked. I mean, I really expected Ghana to come up, the Akan, because that's so much a part of the collective memory. But then when I ran the figures through the 35,000 slave voyages, between 1612 and 1625, the only thing that's listed for the voyages from Africa are 406 from Congo area, West Central Africa, which is really interesting. And they're coming throughout. So even though Biafra and the Gold Coast are first and second in terms of numbers, and it doesn't mean that the highest numbers means that that's the culture that's most prevalent, but it is interesting to see the numbers that Congo, people from West Central Africa, which is Congo Angola area, they're coming throughout. There's not a period where they're not coming. It's very interesting.
So how do you interpret that?
Well, you know, for example, this research and some of the work I've been doing in Trinidad as well has led me to Congo. So I was there for a year and a half. And Mile and Miela, which is the plural of Mile, the way they say it, Mile, or they'll say Mayala and Miela, that term is powerful, and being enriched by that connection, the knowledge, like as she said, of the herbs, of whatever they might need to solve their problems. So it's still a very powerful, active, philosophical, theological principle for them in Congo, especially in the lower Congo, where they have a lot of movements that look very similar to Revival Zion. These prophetic movements.
Let's go back to the phone lines. Hello, caller, good morning.
Africa Love, good morning.
Greetings, my brother.
Yes, my brother, my sister. I'm enjoying your program.
Thanks.
And it's just something I'd like to understand, you know, because my understanding of Obia or Hobik, you know what I mean, is in concerning of wherein it was an African spirituality. Now, after the European had reached to Africa, they discredit this thing, you know what I mean? It wasn't a spiritual thing after they went there. It was more a physical thing coming through their powders and their highs of destruction. You know what I mean? In concern of depriving the African of their spirituality when communicating with the Almighty, you know what I mean? So we in Jamaica here, we have adopted a very negative tenderness where the word hobia is concerned. Because even in language, it's a different meaning. And this is how they set the thing to confuse us. You know what I mean? But our basic of spirituality came through hobia or hobic or whatsoever they may call it now. And this is where the European, has destroyed our thoughts of communication with our Father.
All right, I have to go for a break, my brother. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, well, I just want to ask a question, in concern of what she's saying.
Yeah.
That, to me, that's really a question, but it's more positive.
Okay.
To know what she's saying, and I hope I'm...
All right, so we'll have a response to that right after the break.
Okay.
Thank you, as usual.
Thank you.
All right.
Informative. Change. The time is now and the place is here. Andrea Williams. On IRE FM.
Back with you and to your telephone calls, your emails, your tweets, and your Facebook posts. 974-5079, 5051, 5043, and 1-888-991-4152. That's toll-free line. That's Dean at L. Okay. You're saying Christians, and you're on Twitter, you're saying, are we now as Christians to turn from our wicked ways and go after truth instead of our corrupted beliefs? Post-Christian. All right, so we'll take that right after this call. Hello, caller, good morning.
Hi.
Hello?
Hello?
Good morning. Do you have your radio on?
No.
All right, we're getting a feedback from you, but go ahead, let's see if we can hear.
Oh, good morning. I'm Julian Eagles. I was just saying with all the revolution and celebration that's taking place, I wanted to make everyone know that there's an all-mansion taking place the 21st of October.
Yes, I think we just mentioned that.
You did?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks anyways. I just want everyone to know that this is a final effort for the all-mansions to really come together and function as one.
All right.
Please.
All right, Junior. Take care.
Yeah.
All right. So, should the gentleman who talked about turning from our wicked ways as Christians, post-Christian, I don't know if you have a response.
Oh, sure. I think the best things that Christians can do is not condemn something they don't know about, and to be open to the beauty and the spirituality that is present to us in the universe. I think that's what the African traditions teach us, an openness. I think people should practice whatever religion is feeding their spirit and feeding their soul. No one should be dictating that for another person. But for me, it has to be a religion that values me as a woman of African descent, values my body, my person, all of me. And if Christianity does that for people, go right ahead and do it. I think they should do it. But I think what's troubling is the denigration of other traditions, and all Christians certainly don't do that. Many Christians don't. But there is that trajectory in the Christian tradition, the monotheistic trajectory that is threatened by anything else. So that would, I think that's the lesson, that people should really be where they're comfortable, where they're being nourished, but be respectful of other people's traditions.
Well said. Hello, caller. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, very interesting topic.
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Ahobia is a thing that really exists. You can't discount it, and you can't say it doesn't exist. People do to people. Sometimes people say, boy, it's in the mind, and they don't believe. But as you go older and see things that happen, you have to question why there is another force than Christians. I noticed that Christian people usually mass and say nothing like that exists. But trust me, what I see and what I know, the study of different religions and so forth, Obia does exist, and it's a part of a religion that people believe. As you head out them for them gone and old man. Trust me, it does exist.
All right, and you've taken me to another question for Dr. Dianne. Thank you very much.
All right.
All right, as we look at Obia as it is today, and Obia during the period of enslavement, how does it differ?
Well, I'm constantly collecting material on Obia because I would like to do a larger project on Obia, or maybe work with some others to do a larger project. I think one of the things that happens is the European occultist material, the Dolorance material, the literature that comes in the early 20th century, seeking more esoteric resources, utilizing more esoteric resources, and maybe I don't know, but this is just my hypothesis, that as we've become more alienated from the knowledge that would have been passed on orally, perhaps Obia practitioners sought that knowledge in scripts, in written scripts, and oftentimes those were coming out of the European occult traditions.
Let me ask you this: without the anti-Africanness that in terms of how the African religions were viewed during the earlier periods of enslavement, and also the subsequent criminalization of Obia, how might we have been viewing Obia differently today?
I think first and foremost as a tradition that heals. That this is where I go when I'm having either social or physical problems and ailments. It seems that way, that healing is critical in all kinds of healing. Family problems, social problems in the community, actual physiological problems. I think first and foremost that way, especially when we compare what's going on in the broader Caribbean to places like Suriname, where that's how the Obia priests function. So I think that would be significant, because healing and religion were so intertwined traditionally in African context. But I've said to others before, one of the things that happens is, in terms of the impoverishment of African traditions, is, okay, so Christianity becomes the legitimate institutional space for expressing spirituality, and we take all of the good stuff, all of what we have of our Africanness, clapping, or the way we rejoice, the way over into the church, and then we go back and interact with Obia in this way, right? We go back out of our own desperation and interact with Obia as if it's some sort of magical instrument that's going to give me what I want now. So I blame the people who want to use Obia in that way, as well as the Obia expert who will move in that direction for any kind of negativity, if that makes sense.
It does.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
if that makes sense. So all of the stuff, so to speak, the core of spirituality is happening in the churches, and then so we then interact with the Obia expert in a manner that that probably would be more antisocial. Do this for me, get this for me. I know a Yoruba priestess in Atlanta. She doesn't do any kind of divination readings, and she said, "I'm not interested in if your husband leaves you, let him go." She's very much involved with reading the Ifa scriptures, or let me not call them scriptures, Ifa sacred texts, reading them and getting at the deeper philosophy. And that's the problem. What happens when that's why I list those 6 features. There could be more. Mm-hmm. But when we reduce everything to the practical deployment of mystical power, that's all we see. And we don't see what else is around the tradition.
And then also for our own understanding, in terms of understanding that the point you're making of Obia being a religion is to understanding within that broader context of the characteristics of continental African religions, and what Obia presented within Jamaica in the earlier period, as opposed to it being reduced to what it is now.
Exactly. And I think especially in the earlier period, it is hard to understand Obia as not being more expansive, particularly because that was the term that the colonial empire understood. That's all they knew. They didn't have the insider terms. They didn't know what people weren't really calling their religion anything anyway, right? They were probably calling the name of deities or ancestors, or giving the name of what they were going to do that night, or that for a particular ritual. But I doubt they were saying something like "I am this," right? Because
that is so important.
They don't come from societies that say "I am this."
Even now within our own context, because going through life, you have to fill out forms, and
right.
you do some, and people ask you what your religion is,
right.
And sometimes I stop and say, well, African traditional religions, but I don't have a name for any
right.
African traditional. I just write African traditional religions.
Right.
That's what I am.
Wonderful.
In terms of the religion. Mm-hmm. But then, so this morning when you said, because we weren't naming our religion, so I just embrace all of them. So, hello, caller. Good morning.
Good morning, Sister Andrea.
Hey, greetings. How are you doing?
This is Sister Pat.
Hey, Sister Pat.
Trust me, Sister, over this. I just coming off a mission. I want to big up this brethren, one of Bob Marley's family. Mr. Webley, wherever he is risen from the dead. I big up Gilly. Both of us went on that mission. And trust me, Sister, it really exists.
Which mission? Did you want to talk about a mission?
I wouldn't want to talk about it private, but that brethren recover from that hobby scene, man.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing.
Yes, have a good day.
All right, so she's talking about the healing powers of opium. I know the calls are coming like crazy and we're getting so many. I'm not reading the Facebook post because the computer is too far from me and I put down the phone, as you can see. So we're really not doing justice to our listeners out there who are trying to get in all different areas. But I really want to talk a little bit about some of the other stuff you've written about in the book, because here we are, not even halfway in the book this morning so far, because you've spent a lot of time on the Native Baptists, on the revival Zionists, and Rastafari. Can we talk a little bit about those? Yeah. And I'm sorry, callers, just hold on for me. We'll come back to you.
Right. The Native Baptists and a number of other scholars have written about them. And what I was really doing at this point in the text was to trace this liberation theology that emerges throughout. So the Native Baptists begin to emerge and be talked about in the records in the early 1800s. And the missionaries and the historians who were writing at the time always associated with a Mile Foundation.
That's a Native Baptist.
Yes. But an important connection there is the African American Baptists who came over, George Lyle coming over to Jamaica from Georgia, and many others from the U.S. South coming over either as loyalists because they fought on the side of the British during the American Revolutionary War, or as settlers. And they came over and they were the ones who proselytized. And scholars often say this about Africa too. It's not until Africans begin proselytizing Africans that the wider community really takes off. And that's what scholars argue. It really was with the introduction of the Baptist tradition coming from Black Baptists that it began to take off. And then they are the ones who write to the London Baptists for help, to come and help them. And by that time you have an indigenous church structure that from what I've read, it seems very clear, or let's say likely, that George Lyle did try to adopt a more traditional Christian structure. It's hard to know, but it seems
by traditional, what do you mean?
I mean something that would be more orthodox, more in line with mainline institutional Christianity. It appears that he did try to establish a structure like that, but it was not even within his control. I mean, there were others who certainly allowed for many more Africanisms, and it begins to manifest itself over time, and the missionaries are complaining about this. What is interesting is that the Native Baptists often emphasize dreams. Like I think someone was talking about how dreams and also going into trance manifestation allows for an opening up of information, of knowledge, and so they would emphasize dreaming particular dreams in order to have membership into the church. And that was true from the region that George Lyle came from as well. So it's a little bit of a mystery to me. That's some of the research I'm doing now. When we look at what Native Baptist and Revival Zion is looking like, and we look at the Gullah region of the United States, and then we look at where some of those African Americans also went to Trinidad, and that's where the spiritual Baptist religion is coming up. So I'm not saying that they're responsible for it, but it's interesting that when you put them in the mix, somehow there is a similarity across the different contexts, and I find that missing link fascinating. We often talk about the European Baptists, but we don't do enough work on what the African American Baptists brought. So an emphasis on dreams and vision for membership, an emphasis on, there were also esoteric codes and knowledges, initiatory experiences with the divine, being able to convey knowledge of particular kind of esoteric material.
How would this?
You're listening to a rebroadcast interview with Dr. Dianne Diakite the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey. We'll be right back. Hey guys, welcome back. You're listening to the Running African Show, and we're in the final 10 minutes of our special feature. It's a rebroadcast interview with Dr. Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey.
So interestingly, the native Baptists then represented not the Baptists that we've come to know today, which is the more Eurocentric kind of Christianity, but something that was more African in its manifestation.
Absolutely.
And even you write in the book about the 1831-32 Emancipation Wars and the role that the native Baptists played in that, and then you make the distinction between the role that the native Baptists played in those Emancipation Wars and the role of the other churches. Talk to us about that.
Well, once again, I think the insight from an African perspective is that there is potential in every tradition, right? You don't close off options, and so the wider missionary structure, because in the wider missionary structure, they allowed for class leaders to work with new converts, to work with them in special meetings. It became a space that could be usurped for a particular political and spiritual agenda. So in some ways, a gifted preacher, orator like Sam Sharp, who also read, he was literate, he could utilize that structure to galvanize many people. So what I think is we should probably keep in mind is that even for people who belong to the missionary church, which Sam Sharp did as well, for them, it didn't necessarily discount their belonging to the Native Baptist Church or interacting with it or having a network of connections with the Native Baptist churches.
And you talk about even quoting from, I think, Sam Sharp's testimony, or a conversation he had with maybe one of the, remind me, but where he said he talked about the oath as opposed to his obligation to
disgracing the gospel
to the gospel.
And this is where you see a real liberation theology. I mean, for him, he saw a connection between the political will to be free, to be a liberated human being in control of his body and his labor. He saw the connection between that and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so the concern was, if we strike, if we refuse to work, won't we be disgracing the gospel? Because that was the missionary agenda. Comply with slavery, don't disgrace the gospel. But the gospel was being read through a particular light. It can be read in a very radical light, and that's what they did. And my argument is that the inspiration for that is coming from their experiences as bonded persons and from their African spirituality. It's not coming from the missionary spirituality, is what I would argue.
We just 7 minutes to go inside the program. Now, one day, Novia Condell is tweeting that we should be talking about this all day, but we're really close, nearly out of time. So then that's quickly about the Native Baptists. At the end of the day, the Orthodox Baptists actually came out and said they were not a part of the Emancipation Wars. What happened to the Native Baptist Church eventually?
Well, I believe that it really becomes reconfigured as Revival Zion, and certainly other scholars have talked about it, that it becomes suppressed. And it's interesting, when you see these periods of suppression, somehow the African spirit rises up again. And so there's this revival in 1860 and then 1861. And I love the way Leonard Barrett puts it. He said it wasn't a revival of Christianity among the slaves. There was no Christianity to revive. I mean, we really don't have massive numbers of... It wasn't a revival of Christianity among the slaves. There was no Christianity to revive. I mean, we really don't have massive numbers of Africans really having extensive opportunities to even convert to Christianity. I mean, the planters were so in opposition listened to it, I mean, it took people away from their work regimens. They were suspicious of it. They thought, learning to read, learning to write, empowered by the message of God, they were fearful. So they really are not having massive opportunities to convert until the 19th century, the early 19th century. So
this revival,
Barrett argues there wasn't. It was a revival of Mile. It was and you really see similar descriptions with the revival Zionists as you do with Native Baptists. The thing is, with Native Baptists, we don't have as much, at least I haven't been able to see as much about the rituals themselves that we see with revival, with Edward Siaka's research, in the 70s. We don't have those kind of details. We do have details about them, their veneration of John the Baptist or respect for John the Baptist and the dreams and the visions, but we don't have the kinds of details like we have with revival.
In the Native Baptist. No. And out of revival, and revival still exists in Jamaica today. I noticed that you said in the book, it is a Bible, in the book that this is we're at a point in the research where it would be good to see from here what revival is becoming. Exactly. Because this is very important.
Ennis Edmonds, who writes the book, From Outcast to Culture Bearers, Rastafari, From Outcast to Culture Bearers. He's a Jamaican scholar. He teaches in the States.
Is it Horace?
Ennis Edmonds.
Oh, Ennis.
He is conducting a newer study. I don't know how far he is along with it, but looking at the fact that now many of the revival churches are interested in more modernizing the technology, the kinds of instruments they're using, getting also connected, paired with Pentecostal, more charismatic American churches, and really becoming more mainline. So that is true. I mean, it's important to kind of see what is becoming now. But one of the things that was clear to me, every revival church I stepped into had a reading room. Very interesting. A reading room, at least in the late 1990s. And there was the priests and
by reading, you don't mean a library.
No. Absolutely.
You get
spiritual divination. Right, the room itself, I could write a book just on the room itself. Mm-hmm. I mean, the connections with other African Caribbean religions. And they were very knowledgeable about plants, healing, very, very knowledgeable, central to what I experienced.
Right, even today. Mm-hmm. And obviously, just to reiterate that, it would be interesting to see what is becoming. And I stress that because since 1990, we've been having live revival services in the studio every now and again. Okay. But in recent times, we're finding it more and more difficult to do that. And we have been told quite right up front that we are not that anymore. Right. We are becoming something else that is, and we look at that now as something that is negative. So and as a result of that, we haven't been able to get a revival service in the studio in a long time.
But it will probably happen again. It will resurge. There'll be a resurgence. There usually is.
So and then you talk, and look how we're running now in the last 2 minutes. So you've talked about revivals, and in the book you talk about Native Baptists. You also talk about Rastafari and Kumina.
Yes.
So Kumina before Rastafari, because you're looking at a kind of a trajectory in terms of where we are today. Mm-hmm. So in a minute.
Okay. Just say something about Kumina.
Yeah.
Kumina comes into Jamaica between the 1840s and 1860s. What's fascinating about Kumina, as one of the callers mentioned, is that they identify Mayal in their tradition as that state of pure manifestation when the ancestor has come, and usually these are for healing ceremonies. One of the things that I found very intriguing, once again, I just thought I would see Ghana all over this place, and so there are communities there that were still speaking, at least in the late 1990s, a dialect of Kikongo.
Of course, yes.
So even when I went to Congo, for example, and I kept hearing the word mai for water, mai all the time, and I was thinking, okay, that's interesting. But when I got to the lower Congo, to Shela, and Mayombe, which is where one of the religions in Cuba gets its name, everybody was saying Lango, which is exactly what they say in Kumina country. So it's really interesting to make some of the comparisons that I've been able to make from here in Jamaica over there. But it is a tradition that is heavily centered around embodied dance spirituality, connecting with ancestors. Of course, once again, the knowledge of herbs and plants, very very important. The preparation of herbs, treating the herbs as if they are part of the spiritual community, really. It's been fascinating to watch all of that.
And then towards, well, this is where I have one more chapter to read in your book, and you've also talked about Rastafari, and there's an entire passage in the book there, quite a bit on Rastafari itself. Let's go out with that.
It's interesting. At the time that I wrote it, I didn't talk about Rastafari as what I was calling an African-derived religion. And these categories that we have to create as scholars, as shortcuts for explaining, major phenomena, they all have their shortcomings, right? But some of my own students have pointed out that, yes, Rastafari is an African-derived religion. You were being too rigid on how you looked at your own 6 features, right? Those features of African religion. I really saw Rastafari as an African-inspired Jamaican-derived religion. That's how I looked at it. That is very much connected to this legacy, as Bobby Hill had said many years ago, because they are emerging. I mean, the early leaders of Rastafari are either emerging out of communities where Kumina is strong, revival. Many of the reggae singers, their parents are revivalists, or they're in relationship with revivalists, or they're leaving communities that are revivalists to do something else.
And you mentioned the work of Barry Shavans in this regard, because we've had conversations with Barry before he passed about this very thing.
Yes.
I know he had a kind of backlash from the Rastafarian community when he talked about that revival connection to Rastafari.
Well, but it is what it is. I mean, I think it's difficult to disconnect it. I mean, one of the things that George Simpson wrote about, a white American anthropologist, when he was doing research in the 50s, was the similarities in their rituals, but the theology, the ideology was very different. And that's what I picked up on. That here again, where in some of the revival theory, reach Zion, you can get some of that feel, but what the Rastas, I think, in some ways, talk back not just to the missionary church, but even to the revival tradition in a very forceful way to say, no, we have to be liberated right here on earth,
That is what we're going to leave it, with that voice from the Rastafari, we have to be liberated right here on earth. Dr. Dianne, you're a jewel. Thank you very much. And I really want to say once again to our listeners, buy the book. You are a professor of theology at
African American Studies and Religious Studies at Emory University.
Right. We didn't talk a lot about your academic scholarship, but we'll talk about it another time. Thank you very much, Dr. Dianne. So much in the book, so much to find out, so much to know.
Thank you for having me. I'm so grateful.
Well, good, and tell him mother one howdy.
Okay.
All right. This is all we have to say goodbye from the program for today.
And we've now come to the end of Running African. And got to remind you that this morning the programs were rebroadcasted from September 1, 2013. The first interview was with Professor Andrea Williams, and she's the author of Help Find My People, the African American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. And the last one that you just heard was an interview with Dr. Diakite, the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey. Hope you enjoyed. DigiChris sitting in for Kabu Mahad Kheru. Also got to say big up to Joy Morgan, who produced this morning's show. Sun and Sunshine is next.